the Post-Professional Program and Travel Fellowship chaired by Dr. Charles Moore at the University of Texas. Very warm welcome to you, Architect
Thank you.
Pinkish. Yeah. And also we have another speaker, Architect Meghal Arya. Arya Architect specializes in projects in the public realm, a distinction achieved by very few firms in the country. The dignity of public architecture becomes the purpose. The aim is to access a range of citizens who are otherwise on the margins of society. The office philosophy hinges on the idea of appropriateness, and all projects are assessed in terms of the design brief, context, site, and economics to evolve spaces most suitable to the environment of inhabitation. This entails a work method that is embedded in a close relation with the site. Some of the projects of the office include secondary schools in villages, public institutions in rural areas, bus stations and other facilities for the BRTS, sports complexes, universities and parks, zoological parks. The office is also involved in tourism facilities like restaurants, exhibition spaces and heritage hotels. Vijay and Meghal Arya, partners of the firm, graduated from School of Architecture, SET University. Vijay completed his postgraduate studies at the Aalto University, Finland. His sensibilities for structure result in spaces that engage with the structure as a spatial and material experience. His belief in an innate dignity for all people steers the practice into the realm of public spaces that is supported by a commitment to quality. A fine perception of scale enables humanizing the banal and drab expanses of public domains within which most projects are inserted. Meghal completed her master's in architecture from Georgia Institute of Technology, Atlanta, USA. Her ability for abstracting and analyzing contribute conceptual strength to the projects. Pursuing academics as a way to make a meaningful impact, she engages not only with students through design studios and history courses, but is involved with faculty development through workshops for teachers. Her interest in traditional architecture led to several publications and a PhD in the water architecture of arid India to appreciate the deeper meanings and cumulative knowledge systems embedded in traditional architecture. Once again, a very warm welcome to Architect Meghal Arya too. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. Now I request our first speaker, Mr. Pinkish Shah, to kindly share the presentation and begin with the talk.
Sure. Thanks. Yeah, can you see the screen?
Yes, we can see this.
Okay, great. So thank you, Dr. Mamta Raj, for inviting me to speak today, and also Professors Rachna and Professor Maithili for coordinating, and especially the student body who I've been kind of told has been kind of very active in kind of sourcing speakers. So thank you everybody at the BMS College of Architecture. Before I kind of proceed, I just want to kind of make clear that the work you see is not kind of my work alone, but the work of the firm, which is both Shilpa and myself. And of course the great kind of design team that has been with us through the years and continues to be with us, a group of young enthusiastic architects. What I'm going to speak on today is kind of building ideas, and both these words are kind of important to us. The idea of building to actually kind of make and make happen in reality, and to kind of engage with the reality of making is something that's important to the firm, but it's also exploring ideas and actually looking at ideas that structure our work and become kind of the impetus for the project. So both of these are important to us, and the I mean, how do we kind of really go about looking at our projects, or what connects projects across, the various scales that we have, or the kind of building types, or the kind of years that we've been in practice, is trying to find strategies on site which kind of are able to pull together, the various demands that are placed on architects, which whether it's, site, climate, various technologies, clients who come with their own kind of demands, regulations and authorities, consultants, or whatever that may be, everything that kind of in some sense influences a project. And through kind of patient kind of search and research, we basically try and evolve an idea that is able to collapse or incorporate all these forces within that. And that concept then is used to kind of develop the design at all levels and at all scales, and that then creates a unique kind of architectural language for each project. And that's why we kind of insist that in some sense every project is kind of starting from scratch to actually look at what the demands of the project is, and to kind of keep ourselves in some sense at bay. It's I wouldn't say that we don't kind of enter our projects, of course we do, but it's kind of the primacy of the idea that slowly begins to take over. What we're going to see today is 5 projects which go across various scales. So we're going to see something from the size of a room, the smallest kind of project we've done, to kind of home, then a small group housing project, an institution, and then like a fragment of the city. So all of these, besides kind of being kind of separated by the kind of scales, what I would kind of really like to kind of demonstrate in some sense is that how a central idea actually structures thought for that project. And it is based on the scale possible that there are another set of ideas, secondary ideas, sub themes that are always running constant to these, but it's always a kind of a central idea, like I mentioned, which is holding the whole project together. And that's really kind of our kind of search across projects. So the first one we're going to look at is at the scale of a room. Like I mentioned, it's the smallest kind of project that we've done. It was for one of our very close friends who lived in this beautiful doubly kind of vaulted shell structure actually, and they had like really good height in their living room. And as their daughter was actually growing up, requested us to create a small room for her, as she was kind of outgrowing the current room that she was living in. And we thought, what a fantastic opportunity to actually utilize that space, that kind of volume that they had within their home. And what we really did was to kind of perch this really lightweight structure on the kind of existing wall that there was. And the structure, the room in some sense became a kind of a toy for the child. And it was a space that she could use and manipulate based on her whims, her demands, her moods. And it's actually something that she could create kind of levels of privacy or interaction based on how she kind of really felt. And unlike a lot of our projects, this was actually all the kind of drawings that we did for the project. It was really kind of a quick sketch and kind of really articulating what the whole project was about. So it's there's an existing wall which kind of was there, which kind of screened the kitchen from the living room. We just perched a series of really light wooden rafters, and the entire shell was done out of plywood that was out of rubber wood, and it kind of gets encased eventually with this really lightweight skin, which is opalescent polycarbonate, which kind of really kind of glows with light depending on where the source of light is, I mean, so very, very kind of simple project, and it becomes a really kind of fascinating tool for her to kind of engage with that space. And we kind of tucked away this kind of staircase in the kind of existing space of the wall itself. And this really tiny room pretty much provides for everything she needs, from kind of the bed, the desk, the wardrobe, and everything that kind of kids would need. Uh, the second project, moving on, is a house that we were called to do, and uh, I mean, it's this project is really kind of driven by the concern that we kind of see in society, and kind of the tremendous amounts of waste that we as a society have been kind of generating. And you can actually look at, like, Mumbai is, like, the worst culprit in that sense, and this is expected to kind of keep rising year on year. And like, what can really architects do about this? And so is waste really a problem, or can we turn this kind of notion of waste to start thinking of this as a resource instead of really becoming a waste? And does architecture really have a role to play? I mean, can we change our negative perception of waste that we have? And this is especially true in kind of, I think, the Indian context. And what we really thought that what would be really useful is to insert waste into the cycle of cultural production. And what does that kind of really mean? I mean, I mean, very simply means that we need to kind of do many things with the idea of waste. I mean, you could, like, make movies on it, you could write books on it, you can create art with it. And the more we kind of start talking about this with kind of society and reaching out, it can slowly begin to change our perception of waste. So the house that we eventually kind of called Collage House aims for this transformation of this kind of really ambivalent relationship that we have as a society with waste. And this is actually not something new. If you look at a lot of artists in the West, for example, in the 50s and 60s, were really doing a lot of this themselves. For example, you look at Louis Nevelson, who in the late 50s was kind of walking the streets of New York, picking up kind of trash out of trash bins, and assembling these really kind of large assemblages out of that waste, and she would paint them like gold or white or black, or at the other extent, someone like Richard Hamilton in the UK, who's kind of creating collages out of kind of found objects. And that's really kind of what we, is kind of the kind of driving idea in some sense for the project itself. This is the site. It's in New Bombay, in a kind of suburb called Parsik Hills. So it's actually two ridges actually atop the hill, and that little red circle actually kind of shows where the site is. So, when we were told that, oh, this is kind of the top of the hill, and the kind of things that come to your mind first are like, oh, you're going to get these fabulous views outward, and you'll be able to, the sea is pretty close, and you thought you'll get these lovely views outside. But when we kind of reached the site, it was kind of rather bizarre, because on the right of us and on the left of us, there were already two buildings that were kind of already existing, and there was somebody in front of us who was already kind of begun construction. So we very well knew that we are going to be surrounded by people kind of all around. And what that led us to do very early on is to kind of think of the idea of the courtyard, the idea of looking inward in some sense to create your own kind of world within. And that kind of led to a series of explorations in terms of the building kind of language. And what that led us to was this idea of a kind of a frame and a kind of an armature that kind of contains all these kind of recycled materials, so to speak, within them, or these elements that kind of is them. So that the frame in some sense, and we kind of decided to do it in concrete, becomes the piece that is the kind of singular element that runs through every space and ends up connecting kind of all these spaces. And this is really a kind of drawing which shows that frame in the middle, the gray kind of piece, and all the kind of different elements, the components that actually eventually went on to become the house itself. So these were some of the early drawings we had done to kind of show the client, where we're looking at this kind of very kind of basic idea about, okay, like, what if we recycle windows and we can reuse stone and we can reuse, like, scrap metal in this entire kind of project. And that yeah, so I mean, I think before I go on, there's kind of this quick little video that kind of shows you the context of the house. So I think let it play and I can continue then. Yes, I think that gives you a kind of a quick overview to the kind of entire house. So again, coming back to so this was kind of, like I said, early explorations for the facade, where we are kind of trying to look at the idea of recycling kind of windows, and that's what it kind of ended up being. Similar but kind of very different in some sense, and that process was kind of really interesting because the windows were eventually found by our client over like many kind of weekly visits to different parts of Mumbai, and eventually we discovered in this place called DAY-3, which is in South Mumbai, where everything that's broken down in the city actually kind of ends up in those kind of recycling yards there. And over many kind of weekends we would go there. We actually kind of picked every window and door, would measure it, would photograph it, document it, and actually figure out a way to kind of assemble this entire kind of collage of windows together. And it's very interesting because our firm is actually used to like extensively drawing out in detail things before they happen on site, but here we were kind of almost kind of thrown off by our normal process, and because it was kind of in some sense almost impossible to kind of overtly figure out exactly what to do. And it was wonderful that it was the carpenters actually who were working on the site, who are actually used to working a lot with windows like this, traditional windows, is against kind of modern detailing for windows, who were actually able to teach us in some sense that how this could really happen. And it was only because of them that we were actually able to piece the kind of puzzle in some sense together. So it's kind of interesting the way it eventually kind of turned out. That's kind of a front on shot. And if you look at the kind of real construction of the whole thing, unlike typical windows which find themselves within a solid surface of the wall and there's a hole and you kind of insert a window inside, here the window and the wall section and the detail actually exemplify that in detail. Is that it works pretty much like a curtain wall. It's actually hung, it's actually suspended in front of the slab, and there's kind of a metal framework within that kind of holds everything together. So very kind of unlike the way a traditional kind of window facade would work. A quick kind of run through the rest of the house. This is really at the entrance. The round drum is actually a puja space. This is vertically stacked glass, which creates kind of this luminous enclosure where when you sit on the floor for your puja, it reveals kind of these views out at eye level for you. And then you enter through this relatively kind of narrow and kind of dark space that kind of leads you above, or you could take this elevator. Again, the elevator has an interesting kind of story. We were reminded a lot of elevators in old parts of Mumbai, in the Fort area, for example, which have this kind of industrial mesh that encloses them. I mean, we really couldn't understand why within your own house you had to move within a kind of a closed box, but why can't you have kind of an aerated kind of space where you can yell and shout to each other? So that's really kind of the way we imagine this. But also in terms of the actual articulation of it, the owners are believers in Krishna, and in fact the house is called Kanha. And what better place to look at, for Krishna believers than to look at Mathura, where the art of Sanji, which is a kind of traditional paper cutting craft, exists. So we took those kind of patterns of the Ras Leela of kind of Krishna done by Sanji artists and actually transform them through kind of an extensive series of drawings to become these kind of industrially, so-called industrially produced panels, but which are actually made by hand by this collaboration in Bangalore between like a Dutch firm and kind of local artists in Bangalore, so a very kind of fascinating kind of collaboration in that sense. So yeah, this kind of staircase then eventually takes you up into that space. I mean, again here, Ahmedabad and the Delhi both have a culture of exposed concrete, but through kind of, I think, our 15 years of practice in kind of by the time we were doing this project, we had realized a slow kind of dying out of crafts and building crafts, particularly in the city, which we thought would be kind of a great place to try and push a lot of these things. So there's actually practically no paint in the kind of entire building, and everything is kind of a handmade or handcrafted surface, trying in some sense to revive kind of a lot of the crafts, building crafts that were actually slowly dying out. This is the space, the living room within. You can see that, you can see the same windows. Each of these windows is actually operable. And there's some kind of very kind of fascinating stories with each of these, but I'm not going to get into all of them. But the glass, for example, was something that actually broke by the time the windows made their long journey from Dotaki to New Bombay, and we actually had to replace all of them. And the client, again, this really enthusiastic kind of person, went and hunted down these recycling shops in Dharavi, where then he kind of had picked 2 or 3 of them where he knew they had kind of good stock, where we would kind of go and then pick out kind of these really kind of interesting leftovers in these kind of different colors, and they kind of become a really kind of interesting addition to that space of the living room. Also on the right, you will notice is there are these strips of stone. Again, most of them have come from the waste that is produced on site itself, but obviously that was not enough for us. So we've actually gone to stone yards, and if anybody of you has gone to the back of a stone yard, you'll see a lot of scrap, lying at the back, and we actually paid for that, dumped it into a truck and kind of got it to site and have kind of recycled and reused it. And these ideas actually then continue right into the kind of furniture and everything. For example, the chair on the right is actually made up of chindi, or what they call katran. It's like waste fabric that actually is used to kind of, make that chair. So this kind of continues into kind of the different spaces as well. That's the dining and the living space. And you'll see the ceiling over here. The structural engineer actually wanted a ribbed slab, and we actually have managed to kind of convert that into this kind of faceted exposed concrete ceiling, and those kind of diagonal kind of lines then begin to pick up in the floor as well, which is this kind of fantastic hand done inlay, which one man kind of did for 45 days. I mean, so the idea is that we have the kind of this amazing bank and talent of artisans and craftsmen in the country who kind of we really kind of enjoy working with, and that's something you will see across a lot of our projects. So from the living room, you step out into this courtyard, and the courtyard then is really at the first floor, and kind of opens up kind of into the light here. The below the courtyard is actually a 50,000 liter rainwater harvesting tank, which kind of harvests the water during the monsoon time. And you can see those pipes at the end, and those spouts actually become kind of this performance during monsoon times, where they're spewing kind of water that has been collected from the rooftops at that point in time. The pipes themselves are scrap metal pipes that were brought from Kalamboli, which is very close in New Bombay itself, as well as the panels you see on the left side, which is the panels that make up the thing. So water is kind of a very important kind of thing for the house, and sometimes we get these kind of contradictory kind of demands, where at one point one is trying to kind of recycle and save water, but also the aspirations of a client to have kind of a lap pool. But I think as architects we can kind of really make these kind of opposites work in some sense, if we figure out a way to carefully kind of create the system where the water is kind of actually channelized from one source to the other and then recycled to allow for clients to have kind of these luxuries, so to speak, in some sense. So that's kind of the wall. The spouts is something you can see more clearly on this photograph as well. And the wall in front is metal panels that were kind of recycled. And the left side, of course, the open void is where the pool actually happens and kind of overflows down into the courtyard as well. This is some construction shots of waste panels. I mean, from all over the world. There was some panel from Denmark and something from China. And I mean, so whatever scrap that was kind of available to us. That's the powder room, which is kind of, we picked up a lot of waste mirrors, which are all kind of assembled together, but like every mirror is kind of beveled at the edge. So it becomes this completely crazy series of reflections. It's much like a Sheesh Mahal one would find, in a fort or a palace in that sense. So creates this kind of crazy series of reflections. That's the master bedroom. The back is again done with standard frames of paintings, which are available, and they becomes this kind of headboard for the bed, and also the kind of faceted ceiling on the top. This is looking from the master bedroom across the courtyard, and this was really fascinating. I mean, the courtyard as a kind of an idea that has been existent in kind of traditional Indian architecture. It's a great climatic device which works here as well. But also in this case, we had 4 generations of families living here, right from a 90-year-old mother, grandmother, to this kid who was just born, and I think it's really interesting because the courtyard becomes this place which allows the family to kind of negotiate each other, to allow each one their space. But, just by the opening up of a curtain or a blind, allow you to kind of relate with somebody kind of across that courtyard in some sense, So this is the son's bedroom on the first floor. This is again, the client found this trove of printing blocks, which we've kind of used as kind of the back of a wardrobe as kind of artwork within. And the kind of eventual aim here was that with carefully kind of planned planting, that nature kind of begins to take over the house, and kind of slowly the architecture then kind of recedes at the back, and greenery becomes kind of the primary kind of reading that of the space. So the section, just very quickly to point out, the one on the left shows you the rainwater harvesting tank, and also kind of shows you the extra height that the living room enjoys, which is on the right hand side, middle section actually, which just by working with the land, because it was on a sloping slide, we were able to kind of use the difference in section to actually give more height here. And very quickly to look at the top right of the section, which shows this kind of curved slab, and that's actually the water tank. And that's what we kind of did with it, which was this curved fabric kind of slab done with a kind of a lot of experimentations, with tarpaulin and stuff like that. I'm not going to get into the details of everything. There's a story kind of behind everything. So there's extensive amount of material and kind of detailing of furniture and architectural elements with kind of a variety of different materials. This is the back side, where because it's south, it's largely blank, and it's kind of screened again with bamboo here, which kind of filters the light through. And here you begin to see the top. There's kind of a small little kind of structure over there, and we had some spare FSI which the client insisted that we use, and we really kind of were wondering how best to do this. We really didn't want to extend the house because there was a kind of a certain scale that it had begun to establish. So we thought of doing this pavilion, and we kind of sourced these columns. They're about 100 years old, from houses in Kerala actually. And they kind of get used structurally. They actually bolted to the kind of columns below, and with the steel kind of stub columns above, to create this kind of fascinating pavilion, which is this kind of real contrast between kind of the old and new. So the wood kind of begins to contrast with the steel, the stainless steel of the roof, and the kind of glass of the pavilion itself. And that's really kind of a place that then begins to give you these views kind of outwards to the water's edge in that sense, So whilst we do a lot of kind of single family homes. We also do a lot of interiors, especially considering we are kind of in Mumbai, but also because we really enjoy working at kind of a really fine scale where we can experiment a lot with materials and detailing and things like that. I mean, that's kind of a fascination we have as a studio. But it's also that if you strip these homes away from those kind of material aspects and kind of the visual, and actually look at the kind of core of the house itself, what we've really learned by kind of looking at a lot of these houses is that whenever we've been approached by anybody to kind of do their house, there's really kind of no ideal house plan that really fits, and every client in some sense has always, based on our kind of deep interactions with them, needed the house to kind of transform. So, I mean, these are kind of slides which shows what the existing house was and the things we've demolished and the kind of the changes that we made. So there really kind of is no ideal kind of, so to speak. And I think a lot of those learnings that came from our kind of work in doing kind of interiors in some sense has fed into kind of the premise of the next project, which is a housing project we did called Design IY Housing in Lonavala, and kind of then moves from a single family home to kind of multi-unit housing. And if you look at the scenario in housing today, it's kind of almost polarized between these two extremes. One where you get these kind of cookie cutter, mass produced homes, largely developer driven, where everything looks the same and everything is kind of almost identical from within the building to your neighbor's building. It's pretty much kind of the same. Or self-made homes, in informal settlements, which we find where every home is kind of articulated differently by their own needs and kind of the materials they kind of find. And the question that we are really asking, that are there lessons kind of here for us to learn from in some sense and take ahead to really speaking, to really talk of personalizing or kind of individualizing the idea of the home itself. And this is something which society actually does quite frequently. I mean, for example, there is this whole idea of the do-it-yourself, where the idea of kind of an IKEA kind of kit which you could put together yourself, and then you could hack those and kind of really personalize from what something looks from being a very generic object to be something that's highly kind of customized in some sense to your tastes and likes. At the same extent, we are seeing kind of technology being channelized to customize everything from your pair of denims to your own car, I mean, and these are things that are beginning to happen on a very kind of daily basis now in society. Also, we are looking at designers using industrial processes, for example, to really show the marks of production even in industrial in processes. For example, unlike the Bauhaus, which the whole idea was to mass produce a series of perfectly made identical objects, designers are now looking at using industrial processes also to leave their mark on production. So each item is actually kind of different, and these are kind of two examples which you can see. We're also beginning to see crowdsourcing as a means to kind of generate ideas and kind of content. And of course, the idea of open source, which is, to kind of create a platform where others can kind of plug and play within that. And, what are architects really doing about this? And, architects are normally always kind of behind the curve, and we're always late in some sense to kind of catch up to what's happening in society in some sense. So, the question was like, what really can we do? And what we started out for this project was this kind of small basic module for a 40 square meter home. And we kind of worked with this simple kind of tube of 3.5 by 10 meters, which was 3 meters high. And we said that what if we just kind of raise this to 4.5 meters? And what that immediately does is allows us to get more height, and that more height then allows you to add kind of a small loft within. And that really came from two ideas. One is the existing buildings on the site itself. So the site was an old kind of Parsi sanatorium, and the picture on the top top left is actually the existing house, which of course they had figured out climatically to give kind of larger volume works really well for kind of hot humid climate. So it's actually able to move upward and then dissipate. But also came from the idea of looking at informal settlements again, where instead of square footage, they're actually using cubic footage. The volume of the home becomes an opportunity to actually, add these kind of smaller lofts, which actually increase the area within the house itself. Added to that idea, we said, what if every home actually had a garden, however small it may be, attached to itself? So these three things actually in some sense became the fundamental kind of building blocks for kind of the housing. And we use that in some sense to really kind of structure these 5 different sizes of units, which went from 40 square meters to 195 square meters, which became as big as kind of a villa, within the whole community. So it's like a 5-bedroom, 1.5-bedroom, 2.5-bedroom, 3-bedroom, and then a 5-bedroom. So you really have kind of this variety of unit types that actually kind of emerge. And what we did is that all of these different types are very strictly controlled by a kind of module that kind of governs them. So there's a 3.5-meter module that controls everything, all the way from kind of the offices and the shops and even the kind of the banquet hall, which became part of the kind of public program that we kind of did. And that in the initial stages at least came from this idea of maybe producing these modules off-site and then kind of getting them to site, in a prefabricated manner and kind of installing them in some sense. That didn't happen because the scale of the project was not that large, but they still kind of have that, which creates a wonderful kind of scaling across the site, So no matter how big or small your home is, you seem to have a kind of uniform scale that begins to govern your experience across the site. But I mean, is that all that one could do, and what could one really kind of begin to do much more? And what we did then was to create this kind of options matrix, which on the left side you begin to see is kind of an offering of the different sizes. Within each size, for example, in unit A, which was a 40 square meter, you got 4 different types of units, which you could have. And then similarly in the B, you had 2 versions and so on and so forth. But we also began to think of secondary elements, which is, for example, your windows could really, be in kind of a different configuration and in different colors. And similarly, because of the height, we kind of had these screens which were there. You had a variety of screens to choose from, or the way your terrace happened, or the railing happened, or the kind of configuration of your garden. Did you want more paved space? Did you want more green space? The staircase and, the color of your tiling and so on and so forth, And what really happens is that you could begin to pick from this matrix to create, in some sense, your own version of kind of your own house. And what we had really suggested to the client was to actually create an app which becomes really interactive. It allows for clients to then kind of home buyers to kind of keep playing around till they could figure out for themselves that, what is kind of my house, or what is the kind of ideal version of my house. And here you can see that they're actually able to pick each of these components till they're able to kind of produce their own version of the house that they can call home, About the site itself, this is in Lonavala, like I mentioned. It's actually abutting the tracks. The red dotted line is actually the railway line itself. And beyond it, on the bottom, is actually the old part of Lonavala. And then, of course, the top is where the rest of the city has spread. And the orange kind of line you see is kind of the expressway that kind of runs across from there. So this is the way we kind of had found the site. Beautiful kind of green place. Like I mentioned, it was an old Parsi sanatorium. You can, on the top image, you can see the trains actually whizzing by over there, and it is a kind of a railway crossing right over there. And the rear part of the site actually rises up by about 1.5 meters, where all these kind of smaller bungalows sat as a way kind of for recovery for the people who would come there for that sanatorium. So it was our initial intent to actually save all of these houses, but somehow we were not able to work with the developer in trying to salvage them. But we did manage to salvage the 3 you see on the bottom right. And I mean, I'll kind of talk about that a little bit more as we kind of go along. So what we did then is to start with this very kind of basic unit that we had, which I just explained, this 3.5 meter by 10 meter unit. What that does is it kind of grows an arm which adds all the service spaces. It kind of interlocks with another one of these, creates a service court within. We quickly array those across the whole thing and open these out in the middle to allow for vision, access, and breeze to kind of pass through. We stagger these based on site conditions, based on the location of a tree that may come in front of us, or to kind of make sure there are no kind of overlapping views, and then kind of stack these on the upper level. And then we kind of push and pull these at the upper level as well. All of it eventually so that each one is able to enjoy that little piece of green. So the units on the ground floor all enjoy gardens at the back, whereas everything on the upper levels enjoy these little green terraces on the front over here. These gaps then are again bridged across, adding extra rooms for the unit. So if you were a one bedroom in kind of the typical kind of tube, you could extend your house by an additional room within the bridge, what we began to call kind of the bridge units in that sense. So everybody can kind of grow that an extra room. And then we had these walk-up staircase of 3 types that could actually lead you up to your home. And all of these are grounded with these kind of small stone walls. At the level of the site, I'm going to kind of very quickly go through this. We started out with the idea of the commercial building, which was meant to contain shops and kind of offices and a kind of banquet hall for the kind of community, as kind of this darwaza building, this kind of entrance which leads you inside. The client had this perception that units very close to the railway line would not sell, so we kind of set them back a little bit by creating this kind of green buffer. And what that really does is create this street in the middle, pretty much done like the units that I just explained to you. The 3 you see on the bottom there are actually the 3 units we managed to save, which kind of became a small community center there. And the back side of the site, which I explained was 1.5 meters above the general level, became this kind of raised rear courtyard around which more kind of units were arranged over there. So you got this configuration of a street and a courtyard that actually kind of configured the site. And the kind of larger villas then kind of sat within that. So you have this mix, this multitude of varied housing sizes, all kind of interspersed across the site. And this kind of balance between private open space and public open space. So you can see that the yellow, which is the public open space, is kind of largely contiguous, which people could kind of use, and both kind of vehicular or allowing you to kind of traverse the site as you feel across the entire kind of thing. And that's at the end what really emerges. I mean, that's kind of the site plan, which shows, all the different components coming together. With that kind of scrolling section at the back, at the bottom, which you will see slowly rises to become this kind of raised courtyard in the middle at the back of the site. So quickly running through the photographs, that's the entry building through which you kind of enter. This is the left side is actually the banquet hall area, which you could enter independently without disturbing the community. And kind of these exposed staircases, which we kind of created to take people up to the multiple kind of levels. A lot of details of the kind of entrance building itself. These are the banquet halls themselves, looking kind of outward from kind of the inner space. This is the upper levels of the shops, of the offices, where we've kind of used these kind of colorful super graphics to kind of draw kind of attention to them. And these are the units as they build out, and you can actually see that you can see the kind of the modularity or the regularity of the tubes themselves, but the infills on them are all kind of varied. So you have this kind of concrete railing or a metal railing, or you'll have kind of cotton steel screen, or you'll see a wooden screen, and kind of this kind of variety that exists. This is the central street. At the center, roughly at the center, we connected them across with a kind of pergola to kind of break that scale of that linear street. And on the right, you can see these bridge units, which are connected at the top but kind of completely open underneath it. And each of these bridge units lead to a kind of a small play area for toddlers with slides and seesaws and the like. Each of the houses is entered through this kind of small little porch in the outside. It kind of gives you a little moment there to kind of pause, to interact with neighbors, to kind of express yourselves on these kind of little spaces over here. And then these of course are the walk-ups that take you up to your units. And again, kind of snippets of the project, and slowly here again, like nature beginning to kind of burst through the architecture and slowly beginning to kind of take over. That's kind of the street that begins to emerge. And at the end of that street, terminating that, again we've connected it, but this time at the upper level, creating like a larger double height kind of pergola. But what's really interesting to me is these upper level spaces of the terraces where neighbors can kind of yell out to each other and create this kind of sense of community between kind of all of them. These are the units themselves from inside. The left top shows the loft space itself. We made sure that they were kind of filled with light. All of them had windows which they could open and ventilate that. And also the one on the right shows you one of the units with that kind of tall space with the loft at the back. These are the same units with different configurations. You can see the one on the top left is a straight flight staircase where the kitchen is on the right, whereas the one on the bottom right has a spiral staircase and the kitchen is actually in the middle, and it's like more like an open kitchen with the lofts on top. So you can see kind of there's a variety both in the interior configuration as well as kind of the finishes over there. These are the kind of larger villas towards the back. This is the central green in the middle, and those three houses we managed to kind of save are those little yellow colored buildings, which I will kind of get to now. So what we really did after a lot of kind of back and forth with them, trying to salvage all of them, had to give up and really kind of, because we couldn't consume the FSI, to really kind of salvage three of them, which we said we need to kind of convert into a public space so everybody can enjoy. So that was this kind of state of those buildings. And this is what we managed to kind of turn that around into. Very, very quickly kind of run through that kind of, the design of them. So there were these three separate units standalone. The first thing we did is kind of inserted like a volume within them, which actually connected all three. The second step was to actually duplicate one more of the exact same size. There was a set of trees in the middle. We couldn't attach it directly. So, and they needed a small kind of community hall to be kind of also added to this. So that kind of extends that, 3 into kind of a set of 4. We link all these up together through the veranda. They all had their individual verandas, but you can see the small kind of red hatch actually links all the 4 up together. And then we extend the veranda out into a pool deck, which actually has the pool and a kind of a small amphitheater kind of around. And it's also very interesting in terms of section. So the top one shows you the existing condition, which is like very closed. It's inward looking. It's cellular, these 2 rooms. We kind of actually changed that by a structural thing where we opened up these units in the middle by some kind of structural jugglery, where we're able to make it one large space. And one of them actually begins to have like a loft that is kind of added, above that. And the new unit that we added, what we simply did is we took the profile of the existing house and we kind of inverted, we flipped it, and that gave us a kind of roof that, was outward looking, and it brought in a lot more light as against the older ones, but completely kind of changed kind of the spatiality of the unit. And I'll show you how in a second. These are sections cut through, different parts of this, which show you the first one, for example, shows you the new addition of the loft and how you're able to kind of get this relation from that loft and the lower level to the pool deck, the pool, and that kind of green space outside. The second one is actually showing the small kind of connecting units between the existing houses, which the views open out only when you kind of sit down over there. And the last one shows you kind of the kind of expansive outward views that you get from within the new edition of the multi-purpose hall itself. So that's kind of the plan and the elevation of how it all comes together. So this basically accommodates the central area is like a wet area, a wet zone. There's a steam and a sauna and changing rooms, like typical, requirements for things like this. And there's a space to exercise. And so this is kind of actually a drawing of all the structural kind of jugglery that we did. I'm not going to get into it here. I'll probably talk about it on the photographs maybe. This is what actually happens. You see those three buildings all connected by that kind of linear veranda opening up onto the pool deck, and then the pool itself, and the pool kind of spills over into that green space. So the veranda then becomes kind of the most important thing, not the kind of building itself. And really interesting again over here, because all the stone for the veranda, the bases, the wood itself, the columns, the rafters, everything was something that we were able to repurpose from the demolition of the old buildings that were existing on site. So we were actually able to actually create this entire addition in some sense without using much new material, except of course the new hall itself. So we were very conscious of the new additions. We said we really want them to contrast and stand out with the older stuff. So they're made in board form concrete. So you can actually see the casting of the concrete in these thin 4-inch strips. And again, the scale change at every of these units. Only when you sit down that you're able to kind of relate to this kind of outside. So this kind of sharp contrast between what is old and new. This is the new addition, the loft that we added over here. You can see that the two trusses on both sides are actually kind of connected to this kind of steel member that is actually suspended from the top. This is the addition of a new steel loft and a steel staircase. And we actually wanted to do everything in this kind of old heritage style, but we didn't have a budget, and we managed to kind of balance the budget by taking these really small patches of. So it's like, imagine there's light streaming through those windows, and they kind of almost like light up the past in a sense, and it kind of reveals those kind of old tiles. So I mean, it's kind of an interesting play of those. These are some of the other wet areas. That's the kind of gym. Again, you can see here the wall that's been removed in the middle with that steel, fledged beam that is added, and the wooden trusses actually transfer the load onto that kind of steel beam over there. And that's kind of the from outside where the veranda wraps across and creates this kind of small kind of community amphitheater here. This is the new addition. Like I mentioned, you get these views kind of outward to the trees, lovely light filtering through. But most interesting for us, it kind of opened up a space diagonally, very unlike the other traditional kind of, the speciality of the traditional kind of buildings, to a completely new speciality, which is kind of these kind of diagonal views, and you have these really oversized sliding shutters that open out, which allow you to kind of leak out into that little courtyard and the pool deck as well. This is, I'm running out of time. I'm going to go through these very quickly. This is a competition we did that was held in Satara, actually, which was calling for the main administrative building of the municipal kind of society over here. And this is kind of the site, which is that little red dot, and I'll kind of zoom into that quickly. But one of the things that's really kind of interesting over here is the presence of this Ajinkya Tara fort, which is like a constant presence in the city. And you can see that that's the kind of the top of the mountain with that wall kind of, which you can see in the Google Earth image. And you kind of begin to have these very diagonal views that you get from the site towards the fort over there. So that's the red is actually the site itself, a squarish kind of plot with a little kind of tail at the back. And there's a lot of kind of other institutions around, some kind of hospitals and banks, but right in front of it, the long linear building that you see is actually the Zilla Parishad building. And there are a lot of other kind of government institutions along this kind of main road that kind of cuts to, it's kind of the state highway. But also there's the kind of views which are, at the corner and kind of on this diagonal towards the fort, especially kind of from the upper level. So this is really kind of, in some sense, the beginning kind of move for us on the side to try and link, the city in some sense, and this place of kind of governance to, it's kind of, what shall you call it? It's kind of history and it's passed through the idea of kind of its relationship with Ajinkya Tara. We were also looking simultaneously at this idea of gathering, of governance taking place under kind of far more simpler kind of means. This idea of a shamyana, of this kind of simple kind of roof, this kind of fabric roof under which you could kind of meet and gather. And at the same time, looking at this idea of the ascent, this idea of moving upward to the fort, right from the entrance, which kind of takes you up, or another kind of historic kind of building on the side is the idea of the Kshetra Mahuli temple, which you kind of move up from the ghats, from the river bank up to, the temple in some sense. We were also looking at the same time, the idea of what is it to kind of build a government building, and I mean, the Constitution of India very clearly states in the very first, we the people, and the government is us in some sense, and we kind of tend to forget that, and especially people in government tend to kind of forget that. And it was kind of important for us to start looking at this as something that belongs to the larger public and doesn't become this kind of isolated, closed space only for people in power, And there's this wonderful kind of diagram, this ladder of citizen participation, so done by Sherry Arnstein, and which talks about this idea that we need to move up these kind of different, levels of how the citizen is able to kind of participate with people in governance and in power. And it's very clear that in India we are probably in kind of those lower rungs. I mean, we are being kind of hugely manipulated in some sense every day, where we are really not allowed to participate in some sense in any way, and how can we kind of move from those lower rungs of the ladder to actually kind of up that ladder where it becomes a more citizen kind of centric administration and governance kind of process. So all these ideas came together for us in kind of these three strands. The upper, if you see the vertical kind of strand, it's basically talking about this idea of shade under this kind of canopy, which actually kind of protects and shields the site in some sense. The one on the left begins to talk about the idea of this ascent upwards, basically, and looks at the series of terraces that kind of slowly take you up the mountain, in some sense, from where you can see this kind of the blue kind of opening up of views towards kind of Ajinkya Tara in that sense. And then the building in that sense is supported, or governance is supported by these two arms on either side, which are just kind of this armature within which democracy in some sense plays out. So that's what we kind of came up with. Like I mentioned, these two arms is really kind of light looking kind of roof, which kind of sags above, and the central space that is completely open, to the public at 24/7 in that sense. So the offices could actually shut at night, but the kind of the plaza and the terraces become a place for people to actually gather for kind of events, functions, or just become a new place for the city to kind of meet, So based on all the requirements that they had given us, we kind of, clustered them in these kind of 6 broad volume, kind of different categories, taking VIPs and restricted security access right to the top, but at the same time opening up the lower floors to kind of very kind of public, amenities, which then kept kind of staggering and kind of moving up the entire building. So that's the kind of ground floor of the project. You kind of enter through this kind of, flight of steps, which creates a kind of plaza in the front. And, till that red line, that entire place is very public. So we introduced new programs like a children's civic library, where, this fear of the government is something you can start beginning to remove. in children. This is not something that was asked for in the brief, but we thought it was important. So the left side becomes a kind of library that children could kind of come to and learn about kind of governance and things like that. And then there were these halls on the right side which became multi-purpose spaces for citizens to come and hold events and functions kind of over there. There's a kind of a gallery space also in the middle, which kind of happens, and beyond the red line is basically security kind of driven spaces. So they had a very large requirement for storage spaces, for a lot of filing and stuff like that, dead kind of material in that sense, which what we did kind of very carefully is hide that below the staircase that is kind of running up through the center. So yeah, that's kind of another view of the same kind of, and you see that in the central part of the building where it becomes just kind of a large place for kind of compressed filing. Interestingly, the two cores are not symmetrical, so we kind of staggered them a little bit in the top right diagram. So you create these kind of smaller neighborhoods within the office. You have a very large space to a medium-sized space to a small space. You don't get these, anonymous looking endless kind of office floors that have become, de rigueur in most kind of corporate kind of projects. And you begin to kind of climb up, and right at the top over here, one last floor below the top is we programmed their public, their restaurant or their cafeteria as a public restaurant, which could remain open after hours as well, drawing kind of people up to that kind of place. And this is kind of the sections. You can see the kind of cascading terraces that kind of eventually kind of lead you up, and that visibility kind of across the entire building kind of remains. These are some of the kind of public terraces. The idea here was very simple, that Satara is kind of beautiful climate, and the idea was that this could draw people from within, government officials out onto these terraces and decks to actually start communicating with citizens, and citizens would feel less intimidated by having to step into kind of a public space. And also the thinness of the building allows you to look right through these buildings. You almost kind of make governance transparent, and you make governance at work visible in some sense to kind of people around you. And then this is the kind of plan where you reach this final terrace and the building actually just cuts away and kind of opens up those kind of views diagonally up towards Ajinkya Tara Fort. And the top two levels, of course, is the chamber itself, along with all the kind of VIP activities and all of that. And that's really kind of what happens on the sides. And the kind of stepping kind of notion of the inside is then begun to be kind of reflected on the outsides as well. Last project, very, very quickly, kind of going to run through this. This was the first project that we ever did. This is 20 years old now. I just pulled it out of the bag because I think there were some kind of important lessons for us that we kind of learned here. What we are beginning to see in cities is that we are never going to enjoy kind of doing a homogeneous fabric like, say, the one on the left, which is like Ballard Pier, where all the buildings are uniformly scaled, they have the same height, they have pretty much a similar kind of material palette, and you kind of get a uniform fabric. I mean, contemporary society is not about that, and we are going to see a mix of building types, big, small, tall, thin, short, fat, whatever, I mean. And how does one really make sense of this? I mean, how does one create a city out of kind of fragments like this, And I think what this project kind of demonstrates is kind of this really micro fragment of the city, that what then one needs to begin to do is to not really look at the solids, but to really start looking at the voids that are formed in between these buildings, and how can the voids that are formed become more meaningful. Okay, so I think that's kind of, I think, a lesson in some sense, and that's why I kind of slot this under kind of the territory of the city. I mean, and of course the fact that we will need to support an infinite number of kind of activities on a single site, and that you need to kind of create hybrid programs within kind of a project. And this was really kind of a demonstration of that. So we were approached by this multinational company which wanted to kind of, set up an office here. They had bought this old plastics factory, which you see on the top left corner, a pretty fairly rundown industrial building. They wanted to break it, and they kind of wanted to kind of do a new building, but they also wanted to move in really, really quickly. So we convinced them that don't do this. Let's recycle the building. Let's revamp this building. We'll give you more lofts. We'll update everything within that and put you guys in so you can get started quickly. And then we said we can take the additional time that we have to actually create 2 more buildings. And you can see that in the kind of the drawing which shows phasing or the model image. We created 1 tower, and then we created a smaller, thin, long utilities building. So the 3 buildings, all of them are different. The middle one, which is the plastics factory, becomes a combination of steel, an existing concrete building with additional kind of floors and movement spaces in steel. The utilities building is an all steel building, and the tower is an all concrete kind of tower. So it was kind of fantastic learning for us to actually look at all these 3 things, but it also kind of shows you how 3 different kind of building types can actually coexist. And what is really interesting, and again kind of picking up on the hybridization of the program, is that all 3 buildings at the lower floor work as a workshop. So they have a very interesting model. It's an automobile finance company that is also into leasing of cars, and it's also into maintenance of those cars and of others. So you have like a workshop, a very kind of blue collar space, which is greasy and like relatively messy, but you also have kind of people dealing with finance, in ties and suits, sitting on kind of some of these upper floors. And the tower then became a space the company saw as a space they could expand into as they grew. So whilst we did it, it was actually kind of rented out to a software firm. So you begin to get all these kind of multiple hybrid programs, sitting on one site together. And I think that was kind of really interesting for us, doing this kind of 20 years back when we had just kind of come back, from the US after kind of working and studying there. So what we realized is that the kind of the factory space was this very kind of generic kind of space, and it would kind of see transformation over time with modular furniture being configured and reconfigured, constantly. And what we thought was very important to kind of define that, to have things which would really, really kind of hold this space together. And we came up with this idea of these totems, okay, these kind of totemic objects that are placed within this kind of large kind of volume, which then in some sense, even though they contrast with the volume, actually call out the nature of the space far, far more in some sense. And it is very interesting because we discovered this image by this Czech artist who kind of actually created this installation within kind of an old building. And what we seem to have done is kind of very, very similar. This is actually kind of found post fact, but interesting. Here you can see the section of the tower and kind of the kind of older industrial building, and that kind of little space in between, which basically becomes kind of an entry point where you can begin to kind of go to all these 3 different things. This is the original photograph which you had seen under the roof of the existing building. That's the same wall which was the north face, which we actually removed and glazed the entire thing to draw light within kind of those tall spaces, and kind of created a library there, which I'll show you in a second. The right side, you can see the driveway, which is of the maintenance workshop over here. This is the kind of library space itself where people could pull up a book, sit here on these kind of kiosks over there to kind of, research or grab a coffee along that large window over there. And then these are some of the kind of objects that we introduced. So everything that was newly done within is kind of done in steel. It's fully exposed. We've exposed all the trusses, the lighting, the air conditioning, everything is actually kind of exposed over here, and so are all the kind of additions in detail. So here, this is like a bridge that crosses the central atrium, is all structural. So every bit that you see has been kind of, has a kind of a structural purpose in some sense over here as well. And the detailing of the staircases and the bridges and everything is kind of in exposed metal. This is kind of a small flight that takes you up to one of the lofts within, and you can see that small window underneath this. And it's very interesting if you see in section here again. This was something that the CEO of the company told us in our very first meeting, that at no point do I want the white collar workers, the kind of corporate staff, to forget that they exist because of the kind of workshop and the maintenance that we offer our clients. So there's this kind of continuity between and visibility. I mean, we talk a lot about visibility now of the other, and kind of trying to blur boundaries between kind of different classes of people. And this was something kind of we had done very kind of consciously, where from the office space above one could really kind of participate in the going on of the workshop. You can see that on the bottom right of this image. You can see like cars being repaired below. So this blurring of boundaries between these kind of different parts of the office in some sense. This is kind of the utility building, simple kind of vaulted space, linear passage, and again kind of looks down into that space between the buildings. So this is again a section cut through that gap between the tower and the older plastics factory, where what we've done is we've threaded this kind of staircase that kind of takes you to all three buildings. So you can go right or left to either building. You can climb up and enter the utilities building here. So it kind of becomes this distribution point to kind of go across all of these spaces. And you can see this, it's kind of a skylit space. It becomes like a street, a public space where people kind of hang out with these kind of bridges, crisscrossing all of them. This is from the other side, and that's the tower. And that's all I have. Sorry for having exceeded my time slightly, but that's what I have for today, and I am going to stop sharing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shah, for showing us the glimpses of your interesting work actually, and running us through your presentation. Thank you very much for that. And we'll get back to you during the moderation session, and also questions are already popping in. So yeah.
Great.
Now a small reminder to all the participants to drop in your questions in the chat box, and we'll take them in the moderating session. May I now request Ms. Meghal Arya to begin a presentation, and my co-faculty Tejas will be sharing the presentation for you. Tejas, can you share? Yeah, thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Maithili, for giving me this chance. I'd like to start with, first of all, thanking the university and thanking Dr. Mamta. Like Pinkish mentioned, all of this also happens due to the untiring efforts of the faculty members and the enthusiasm of the students, particularly when in these times we are all rather stressed with online work. And so I was very impressed when all of you took this whole festival together. So thank you all for inviting me. And also, I guess, extracting me from way back of beyond in Ahmedabad. Far distance, but it's nice to know that technology can make these distances so small now. As mentioned earlier, this practice, Arya Architects, is run by Vijay, Arya and myself together. And for us, we were classmates and on CEPT campus, and both of us had a very deep interest in the idea of history. So we actually look at our office as a small speck in that continuum. And in a way, this is a journey of trying to search for what is appropriate, what is relevant. And over a period of time, as the world around us shifts and changes, the search changes, and the appropriate and the definitions of appropriate maybe change. But somewhere behind all of that, there is also this search to try to find out where does one anchor architecture and where does one anchor architects in society. And I have then, in that search, broken up this presentation into two parts, and we'll see what those two parts are as we go. Hopefully, we'll be able to convey that sense of anchoring when we look at the projects. Next, please. So a lot of our learning came from documentation of historical buildings, particularly palaces and vernacular architecture in the desert regions of Rajasthan and Gujarat. This particular plan is of Mehrangarh Fort in Jodhpur, which we've been documenting and measuring and looking at for almost 20-25 years over a period of time, including contributing in some ways to its conservation and adaptive reuse. Next, please. This is the Hawa Mahal in Jaipur. I'm just going to quickly run you through these first couple of slides to put an emphasis on this whole idea of documentation and what does it do when we go and document something which is beyond our own everyday life. It gives us insights, it gives us an opportunity to observe carefully, it makes us diligent about the physical environment in which we are located. And these are the kind of skills that we picked up early on in our careers. Next. The point is not just to document in a mindless way and produce drawings, but also to be eventually able to capture the essence of what we are documenting and to be able to extract and interpret some of that heritage or some of the historical buildings. Through that journey, we in a way tried to see what was the essence of Indian architecture. For us, the essence of Indian architecture then emerged as certain elements of space like courtyards, which were found across the country, and we put these together in a research publication called Thematic Spaces in Indian Architecture. And one finds courtyards of all scales, all articulations across the length and breadth of India. And from here one learns about light, about scale, about intimacy, about publicness. Next, please. About the whole notion of response to climate and response to the socio-cultural factors and response to the materials. Next, please. We also found pavilions of all kinds, and according to us, the idea of a pavilion is probably one of the most ubiquitous elements that is found and adapted and is resilient. Next, please. So one finds that a pavilion can be an empty space and a pavilion can be a space filled with people and it will still hold its own. Next. Next. The third element that we were looking at was this whole realm, which is the in-between space. Based on our climate and culture, we find these spaces like verandas used the most. In fact, if you look at most of our traditional and vernacular architecture, this is the space where we live. We hardly live indoors and we hardly live on the street exactly, but it is this veranda which is the in-between, between the public and the private, between the inside and the outside. And like if you see in this veranda, it also demarcates a certain degree of public and private and who can move into the house and who can stay outdoors. Next. The in-between is also a realm between land and water, and the entire range of ghats and steps to water that we see in our country demonstrate this whole idea of the in-between realm. Next. To the small otla and the small verandas. Next. And of course, finally, the jharokhas, which are giving a peep into the realm of the publicness from within. So, as a totality, one looks at these courtyards, pavilions, and in-between realms coming together and contributing in different articulations, in different kind of combinations and permutations to create the entire gamut of architectural built environment in the country. From this, we extract our learnings, and the first set of projects that I show you are called Architecture a Response, which means that here in these projects, we are trying to respond to the various factors that we find when we are encountered with a program. The first project, next, is the Mewar complex. This was a series of pavilions which was to be designed for Rana Pratap. This was, and to just mention over here that almost 95% of our practice is within the public domain. So the governments of various states and in the country are our clients, and most of the work is being done for the government. So this is done for the government of Rajasthan. And one of the things that the government of, yeah, please hold. one of the things that the government of Rajasthan wanted to do was to create a tourism circuit around the life of Rana Pratap. Rana Pratap was a king who was there in the Mewar region, who was always on the run, and one of the very few kings in Rajasthan who did not have an opportunity to construct anything. So he did not leave behind any edifice or any presence of his rule, and yet he was one of the most celebrated of all the royals. So the government wanted to denote or to capture his life by marking some of the specific locations where significant events in his life occurred, including fight with the Mughals or where he was coronated. So these two pavilions are located in such sites which are actually in the middle of nowhere. And for us, it was really about interpreting the life of Rana Pratap as something which is very simple but very frugal, and also lived with a certain degree of hardship and robustness. Next, please. So we designed the first of the pavilions as a series of 7 walls, which were to interpret his war with the Mughals, which happened across 7 valleys. And what you see over here is simply these 7 walls which have been constructed overlooking the valley, and on the other side you have the hill, and the building sits in between these two realms, in a way creating a tension between the inside and the outside, something that is which is built, something that is which is not built, in a way also trying to recollect or create a sense of a ruin. So you don't really know whether this project is complete or not complete. In fact, one of the MLAs of the area asked us when we were going to put some chhatris on top of this to complete the project. But this is it. This was how it was meant to be. And then we started working with the craftsmen of this area, and these people in near Udaipur, they do this very fine stone workmanship of very thin, fine, flat pieces of stone, which is known as tiri finish, but which is only used for non-structural walls. We worked with them and developed this whole idea of putting the larger stone boulders with the tiri in order to get these kind of surfaces. Next. So one sees within this project many aspects of responding in terms of the history of the place, the program, the intent of the program, the site, the location, the craftsmanship, and the materials. So all these things, all these factors are brought in together in order to contribute to the experience of this space. Next. This is the other pavilion, which is on top of a hill, in fact. And unlike the previous one, which was in the valley, this sits on top of the hill. And to us, it kind of started becoming a way to think of this as a bastion in one of the forts. And then cutting across the bastion, as you can see in the small plan, pointing towards Kumbhalgarh, which was the actual seat of Rana Pratap and his dynasty. So this is to allude to his whole history, and yet it is actually a very simple space from inside. Next. Sitting atop the hill, very robust, very hard, and very introverted. So the idea of security, the idea of the fort walls, the idea of safety within a certain edge is the kind of things that we were looking at when we were designing this. Next. And then you have the space within. Eventually, it was planned that there will be some kind of exhibit of artworks and excavations found from nearby sites, which would be placed within this space. So this is the kind of one of our early projects, and this is the kind of journey that we began and the kind of concerns in trying to find what was appropriate. As we were, so on one hand, while we were dealing with this kind of very rugged landscape, stone workmanship, local crafts, we came across a client found us to do a large sports facility. Next. So this was the KRVIA football stadium, which was a large, it was supposed to be the largest football facility in India at one moment. And it was supposed to cater to some 25,000 spectators, along with a large sports academy, a sports club, and a hotel. So it was a very, very massive project, and we worked on this project for about 3 years. And one of the most important learnings that we got from this project is to be able to handle large variety of aspects that bring architecture together. So you had something like 35 odd consultants trying to help you put together all kinds of services, all kinds of utilities, all kinds of technology, so, materials, all of that, even sports advisors, all of them, and to be able to communicate with all of them, to be able to integrate their requirements while still trying to assert a certain quality of the spatial configuration, while ensuring that in the scale of this project, in the largeness of this project, the intimate and the human is not lost. And this was a fantastic learning for us in how to also look at the idea of hybrid programs. So you have sports facility, but then you also had hospitality, you had the hotel and the multiplex and the sports club. So the idea of hybrid program also came about to be a very important learning for us in this project. Next, please. This project, however, remained unbuilt, and but we took quite a bit of learning from this into our next set of projects. Most of these next set of projects are in the realm of educational institutions. Next. This is the education hub at DU, which was a competition. And like when I mentioned that 95% of our office works with the government, it is largely the work which we have got through competition projects. So these are open competitions. This was an open all India competition with, I think they shortlisted about 135 odd participants, and then 30 were in the next stage, and then next stage, and then finally it was awarded to us. Next. This education hub is in Diu, and Diu is a small island in the south of Gujarat, which is hit by cyclonic winds. It was also a Portuguese stronghold, and at one point it was part of the Union territory of Goa, Daman and Diu. It is now separated as a Union territory with and merged with Daman. It has this fort, which is a low, very heavily guarded fort from the Portuguese times. And once again, one is looking at the existing historical buildings for references. Next. But one is also looking at references of educational institutions in history, and this is of course the most famous Nalanda University, from which we tried to see the organization of the university as clusters of classrooms around a courtyard. From there we got this basic diagram of spaces around a courtyard, and the program gave us a hint of the number of arms that the courtyard would have. The program had 3 colleges: the government college, the government polytechnic, and the food and craft institute. So there were these 3 parts to the program, which were then in a way connected within the around the courtyard. So they were like a pinwheel around a courtyard. So the courtyard acted as the anchor to the entire project. Next, please. I will briefly explain the plan to you, and then we will run through a few of the images of the project. Like I mentioned, so these are the main, is my cursor visible? It's okay.
No, actually.
It's okay, fine. So on the 3, like I mentioned, the 3 sides of the government institution, which is the public college, the food and craft institute, and the government college. We looked at the 3 corners of this triangle, and these were the spaces which were the commonly shared spaces. So you have the administration, the library, and the canteen, where otherwise what typically happens in these government institutions or government colleges is that each one remains within their own silo. Here we looked at the courtyard as a significant entity that would enable all the 3 to come together in events that would contribute, which were the university level or the larger scale entire hub level events, and the other canteen, library were the locations where students from these 3 institutions would come together for through interactions. And we were hoping to be able to break this notion of individual silos and create connections in order to foster the idea of multidisciplinary learning. This is not something that happens very easily in government institutions, and we hope to look at architecture as a way that would enable such a learning. And on the other edge, we have the hostels, which are looking at the backwaters, creating these smaller courtyards. On the lower end, towards the little bit of the urban settlement, we have the faculty housing that would give them a connect to the other residents of the area. Next, please. Next. In terms of the massing, we had to take care of a few things. One, as I mentioned, this was an island which was frequently hit by cyclonic winds. So we had to keep it a highly protected environment, which means we made this highly introverted. We also kept it very low because it also came within the cone of the airport. So you couldn't rise high. So this was a very low two-storied building spread on the ground and yet compacted enough in order to be able to create spaces for sports facilities for these young people in the college. Those sports facilities also became a way to separate the residential area from the university area. Next, please. So these are a few of this is under construction, the project under construction. This is a typical government tendering process. You have to follow the government SORs, follow those whole systems, and then create an environment for such a project to take place. Next. And finally, you have this internal courtyard with many of these semi-open spaces looking into it, and you can easily imagine students moving through these spaces, walking through the courtyards, and an environment of learning and college being created. Next. We tried to work a little bit with materials in a way that would not be simply paint and plaster, which is what most of the government officers were used to looking at. And it was quite a bit of effort to try to bring in exposed RCC to create certain patterns that will create an environment of diversity and a visual kind of palette that would be available for the experience of the students. These kind of cross connections across the courtyard and through different spaces were also hoped to be a way where you can talk about learning beyond the classroom. Next. These are the kind of veranda spaces. This entire project is also barrier free. So we looked at these ramps as a way to connect the levels, not just on the side, but actually coming out into the courtyard. So there are 3 ramps on the 3 sides, and they actually become the most prevalent way of using and moving up and down. Next. Next. The main structure is in steel for us to be able to get these large spans without too many obstructions, allowing the gathering to come, because this project is for about 2,500 students who will be in residence, and it is spread over 25 acres of site. Next. We also looked at different scales of courtyards and different hierarchies in which the interaction happens. So while you have the large central courtyard for everyone to come together, smaller courtyards between classrooms, between administration and classrooms allowed for smaller clustering of people. And over a period of time, we are hoping that these trees will grow and cover these courtyards to give shaded space. Next. Next. We also put in place certain measures for other climatic conditions other than the cyclone. So we put up some solar panels for harvesting solar energy, and we've made sure that most of the spaces have protected excuse me, protected doors and windows so that the lashing during the cyclone is not very harsh on the building itself. We also have a double slab on the top most level for insulation. Next. We've tried to make the staircase a very significant element within this whole thing, like the ramp, because this is where you have this kind of sense of being running into different people, talking to different people, meeting up friends, meeting up other students, checking on which class is next. So you see these staircases as elements within the series of classrooms, and which are essentially enclosed spaces, but as you can see already that they are very well lit through an entire range of windows and these glass blocks. Next. Once again, a large open space for the gathering of students. Next. We also had to do the housing in these projects, and so this was the housing for the faculty, small clusters, and it followed the same language of protected inside with these landscape mounds, which to some extent also referred to the fort on the island. And these were as seen as kind of what were known as the tenement or the twin units, which shared walls in order to reduce the impact of the heat and yet give a continuous flow, because this is once again hot and humid climate. Next. And they had a shared staircase from outside. And this kind of space which is created, which is a double volume with a space looking in, the water tank incorporated within that, and all of that in a way becomes one singular unit. This is for the larger faculty housing. Next. And finally the hostels. The hostels were also designed to have their own small courtyards which opened out, all though it's a doubly loaded corridor with the problems of all the doubly loaded corridors. We've tried to ensure that there is enough light and ventilation within the rooms, and the interaction and the space which is between the girls and the boys hostel becomes the dining area. So on the one side is the boys dining, and on the second side is the girls dining with certain controls in between, because that is what was required of the program. Next. And so you get this kind of a space for the students to hang out after the classes and create certain spaces for their activities, evening activities, apart from the sports facilities that have been provided. Next. And this is the internal courtyard with the corridors overlooking the spaces. The other project that is a small project in the north of Ahmedabad, again very hot but not humid climate. This was the administrative block for the Agriculture University in Dantewada. And what this is, since it was an agriculture university, the whole idea of how does the project communicate with the land was what was at the back of our minds. Next. And so this is what came about as a part of the project, that you had this one linear passage kind of space, and at the head of it was the Vice Chancellor's space, and the Vice Chancellor was actually to communicate with 7 different departments, each of which was headed by a dean. So those 7 departments or 8 departments became these units which moved into the landscape with certain sunken courtyards. This took care of the extremely hot climate of Dantewada. At the same time, it allowed the land from and their farms to move up onto the terraces and merged the building completely with the landscape. So it almost was trying to become a non-building from the side of the farms. Next. And this is how it is in its final this thing, where the half of the building is sunk below the ground level. It is made in stone. We experimented with these stone putties which act as the grills. It's sometimes quite a task to make many of these government contractors work with these kind of detailing. But over a period of time, we found that a good conversation most often brings them on board, and they are then quite happy to put quite a bit of effort in making it work. Next. And these are internal spaces, again as required, lot of movement. We need to give a lot of space for many students which will be rushing by asking for their certain things to be resolved in these various departments. So there's the registrar and there's the accounts and there's all different kind of examinations and all of that, which is all to be brought together over here. Next. So these are the kind of various, what I will now do is also run you through few of the competition projects that we've done. Not necessarily always winning, but still they are very useful to the office as an R&D. So we look at the competitions as research and development. There are ideas which are opened up. There are ideas which are explored and experimented with. And we always keep those with us so that if there is another moment where such an idea can be suitable, can be relevant, it comes back. So we do a lot of competitions, 2, 3, 4 every year, and maybe you win some and maybe you don't win some, but you learn a lot. Next. So this is a central library in the Indian Institute of Habitat Studies in Bangalore. They are now building, they've been running through a small series of buildings within the city. I think all of you may be knowing about this particular institute. It is in your city. And they are now looking at building a full-fledged campus at Kengeri. What was done as a part of the process was to identify, and so this is like an invited competition, but not really a competition, where about 20 odd architects were called in to make presentations about their work, and then they were asked to do certain projects based on the capacities that they demonstrated. Our firm was asked to do the library building, and we started with this very simple diagram of the books in the kind of enclosed space and a pavilion space attached to this solid space of the books. Where does this kind of a diagram come from? It comes from the idea of trying to investigate what libraries mean today, particularly now that we've all experienced this kind of online learning. Do we really need that kind of a huge space of physical existence for the books, or is it possible to look at the library in a different way? And for us, the library was as much a repository of knowledge as it was a space for interaction, for communication of ideas, and for sharing of knowledge. So this pavilion space became the place where ideas could be shared. So it could develop as an exhibition space, it could develop as a space of multiple small audiovisual rooms which could be hired out to the students. We in fact also included a small space for the library for children, because we eventually, when this campus is concluded, it will have faculty housing and they will have their children on campus. So there's a small space for the children. So what you see in the dark is where the repository of the books is, and it has many levels which are layered based on material, on the kind of books, but also in terms of archival material, rare books and rare maps, because this is an institution for habitat studies, so they have a good collection of large maps. So those kind of things will all come in the darker spaces. The lower levels are all for the interaction and the multimedia presentations and exhibitions, whereas on the top layer we have the reading rooms, the reading carousels, and the administrative spaces. So it's a very simple diagram, and this is once again reiterating that for us, from the diagram we add layers of requirement to the diagram in order to enrich the experiences. So the diagram doesn't automatically become the building, but goes through many transformations, additions, modifications in order to reach the final design. Next. So this is just the development of the project. As I mentioned, we had these various spaces at the lower levels and the books, and on the terrace we are going to have solar panels, which will, we're trying, it is the ambition of the clients is to make this a highly environment friendly campus. So we're going to have trying to procure minimum energy from the grid, trying to procure minimum water. So we have a step well which is part of the library where you can actually sit around, and during the monsoon it will collect water. Next. This is another competition which was at Alang, which is the shipbreaking yard in India, and they wanted to make a museum. So this is, and we have won this competition also, and we have the work order, we're waiting for the situation to change and the economy to change, and then we can begin work. The idea was to be able to find a way in which one can bring in the recollection of the ships that come to Alang, and find a way where various aspects of the lives of those ships and of the workers who work in those ships are integrated within the museum. Next. We've sited it along a water edge and found a way to recreate some sense of the section of that ship, because if you go to Alang, you look at the ships being broken, the cross sections that are seen, because it breaks in layers like that, are very, very fascinating, and we hope that eventually a lot of the building material will come from the scrap of those ships. Next. This was another competition that we participated in, which was for the INSDAG, which is the Indian National Institute for Stainless Steel Development. We came third, I think, in this one, where we were looking at trying to explore how stainless steel and its tensile qualities can be explored. So this whole gray box is actually suspended from the central stanchion. So you also then kind of look back on the Kanyan idea of served and servant spaces. So the brown box becomes the spaces which are the servant spaces, which serve the gray, which are the main spaces of the project. Next. So this is a kind of work that we put in for the competition. From here, I am going to move to a slightly different scale, which is not necessarily architectural in its most conservative sense, but really talks about spaces within the city. And this was a competition that we participated in, which was held in Bangalore. I think many of you might be familiar with the Complete Streets competition, which was won by then Janagraha. Next. And we started looking at how do we articulate the edge of the street. So between the road and the final private property, how does one articulate a space that makes available itself for appropriation for the multitude of activities that go on in Indian cities. Indian cities are characterized by these layers, right? We all experience on a day-to-day basis. The problem is that we find them congested because we have to jostle for that little bit of space. And in this, we were trying to talk about public furniture, we were trying to talk about street furniture, we were trying to talk about the modularity of the street furniture, a particular element which can be adapted to become multiple elements. So it can be a street light, it can be a planter, it can be a bicycle stand, it can be a dustbin, a bench, many things. Because then it would be, one of the things we've seen is that the quality of construction suffers when we do these street projects, and we were trying to see if the idea of factory made products which are under governed conditions, which have better oversight in their making, can be brought and then placed in the streets. Next. And then we were trying to look at integrating all these elements to the various activities that are required on the streets. Now, one of the important things, and this brings, so far what we were looking at were projects that were a response, like I mentioned earlier, architecture as a response. Next. And now what we will try to look at is what what I consider where architects don't just respond to what is given to them, so are not just responding to site, context, program, but are advocates of ideas and belief systems. So architecture as advocacy is what we are now looking at, and the next series of projects I consider where somewhere along the line through certain interventions of ours, we are able to modify and change the way we understand our spaces. Next. In fact, since in fact, even the project at DEEV had a certain degree of advocacy in it, most of it was response to the kind of budgets, to the program, to the requirements of the client. Here now we're looking at from response to advocacy. This is a photograph of what happened in Gurgaon last monsoon 2019, and where there was just after one burst of rain, there was entire clogging on the streets and the immense jam that happened between Gurgaon and Delhi. So how does one deal with this kind of a situation on the Indian streets? Next. And what we are looking at through this series of projects is to be able to encourage a modal shift. Can we encourage Indians to move away from the aspirations of private vehicles to trying to say that public transport is a better way to move? Here it's just a small comparison, and important is the very low degree of people on the streets which are using public transport in Ahmedabad. So this was how much large a gap there is between private motorized transport and public transport. So the point is to be able to contribute to the ongoing process, and we are not the only one. There is a large number of people who are now committed to this idea of trying to make people shift from private motorized transport to public transport or even non-motorized transport. In that, where does the architect fit? Because this seems to be largely a policy and planning kind of exercise, which it is. But as architects, where do we stand and how can we contribute to this shift? Next. And here comes the story of the bus stop or the urban transit in our country. This is the kind of situation that one faces where there is no proper location. If there is a location, people are not properly standing. If they are standing, there is a rush. So, I mean, and if the bus stands are occupied with all kinds of activities, so there is no safety, there is no reliability, there is no security. And that is been the kind of story of the bus stops in our country, most of them. Of course, they are also the location of many love stories, but apart from that. Next. So our job was to, within the larger story of public transport, we were working with a large group of people who were involved with the overall planning of the system of the bus rapid transit system, BRTS as it is called. What the BRTS does is to articulate dedicated space on the streets for public transport for buses. And it has been found that when numbers are less than a certain quantity per day, less than 2 lakh people per day, the BRTS actually works in the most efficient way. And many countries in South America have been able to demonstrate this to us. And we said that we participated with the group of people who were propagating the idea of the BRTS. And it started with Ahmedabad and then spread to Surat, Indore, Hubli, Dharwad, Naya, Raipur, Amritsar, many other cities. The Ahmedabad BRTS was a success story, and therefore certain factors that the Ahmedabad BRTS had were extrapolated into many of these other cities. Our role here was to look at the bus stand as the interface between a planning system and the people. So the bus stop is the only visible aspect of the system, where everything else is at the level of the roads and at the level of policy and at the level of planning. How do we make the bus stand a brand of the shift from the private vehicle to the public transport? That was the kind of challenge that we looked at, and we started designing these bus stations. I will show you two of them. I will show you the one in Ahmedabad, which was our first one, and then the Hubli Dharwad, which was the last one in this series. Next. So the Ahmedabad bus station is designed as a very simple pavilion actually, with very high degree of transparency on the edges, because the safety in public space greatly depends on the transparency. You know, Jane Jacobs has talked about the eyes on the street. So if you have very transparent open spaces, they are likely to be safer and more secure. Also, with the kind of climate that we have, if we didn't want to use any kind of mechanical controls for temperature comfort, thermal comfort, we had to keep it open. So therefore, we started looking at this very simple pavilion with certain cables as a way to secure the people, because these are stations which are ticketed, which means you buy a ticket and then move in. So there's a secure space within on which you wait and then get onto the bus. Next. Now, looking at the bus station, we had to do many little, because this is only a 3-meter space in the middle of the road, and it is a, you know, you are fighting for every centimeter of space, and we had to make this very long and narrow space. It's about 50 meters long and 3 meters wide. One of the biggest challenges was, what if two sets of buses dock together on both the sides and a rush of people from both the buses, say 35-40 people from both the buses, come out or want to get on. That gave us the first clue and the stagger which happened in the two sides of the buses. So you see that, you know, the rush is kind of staggered. We also then got some space to put internal seating. We also got a space to put seating on the outside, which allows people to sit while they wait for the tickets. Initially, it was very, it was very heartening to see, because there was a lot of skepticism around this system, and there still remains skepticism around the system. Next, please. But it was very, so we got into a lot of detailing, but it was very heartening to see a lot of people appropriate the external benches and seats, and we also saw some birthday parties in the middle of the night in these bus stations. So the people had actually owned these spaces and appropriated them. And one of the reasons, next please, one of the reasons why that happened was that, as a way to get the bus people to accept these bus stations, we designed one as a prototype. Can we move to the next slide, please? Next. So we got one to be designed as a prototype, and while the construction was going on, and after the construction also, we left it open to the people to come and visit, and we would just sit there, talk to them, get their feel for what they had. This was not done as a proper questionnaire in a scientific way, but was more done through informal conversations, which then therefore started getting the people to try to understand what was going on. The informality of it, I think, made a difference in the way it was accepted. And so this is a lane that you see which was there before the BRTS was put on this, and this is the kind of statistics that we have, that on 550 square meters of road space, if you have only private vehicles, you move about 168 people. Next, please. And after this system is in place, where these dedicated bus lanes come into picture and the bus station is in place, you have about 180 people only on 90 square meters. So this is the kind of difference that this modal shift can make. Whether it has completely happened or not, it's a long time still. Whether we will see the whole country shift to public transport, it's a big question, but efforts need to be made for numerous reasons, including congestion, including environment, including being able to understand ourselves not as socially segregated people, but actually socially integrated people, because the BRTS then makes itself available to entire range of people in the city. We've had many elderly who are very happy because this is an at-grade system, which means they don't have to climb up the steps of the bus, but walk up the ramp and get into the bus. Next. Once again, it shows how the entire environment of this area changed. Next. It also, the bus stations had many it had to adapt to many different, so you have a situation here where there is a system and then there is modifications in the system. So there is a bus station, there is a prototype, but it needs to modify according to location. So here a smaller station was required because research previously showed that the footfalls would be less. This was not a very important destination or an origin of the people, so it's a smaller station. There was certain clamor from within the political and the executive body of the government to have certain heritage bus stations within the historic city. So the lower one you see was our response to this idea of heritage. Next. This was a bus station which was required, which was going to have very high footfall, so it needed 3 bus lanes, 3 bus stops, and not 2 bus bays. All the others are 2 bus bays. So it was a very long and linear ones, even more longer than the previous one. So we created these lights within the slab in order to break that linearity. So you see how architecture starts contributing to the kind of requirements of the program, the requirements of the site, at the same time promoting the idea. For example, the seats within the bus station were not something that were easily accepted, but now they are becoming very important for people to wait. Next. And so a few pictures of how the bus stations have been appropriated by the people and are being used on a daily basis. Next. We also created certain spaces wherever we found an opportunity and some public land. We created certain benches and did certain decent paving, grew some trees, and it became public spaces for the people. And it was, since it was near the bus station, it was very easy to come and go from these kind of places. And you see how the external benches are appropriated by people, how the internal benches are appropriated by people for waiting. Next. This is the last one in the series, which is the Hubli-Dharwad. We had a lot of lessons that we learned from Ahmedabad. And one of the most important lessons was actually related to the idea of structure and utilities. When one is digging in the middle of the road, one encounters a lot of utilities below the road, which we are not aware of. And in our country, they have not been mapped, which means that for every column that we were going to dig for, we were likely to encounter some utility or the other. And in order to deal with that, what we did was put the structure on the two ends. So we minimized the chances that we would encounter utilities and open up the rest of the station for just as a very transparent space. And in Hubli Dharwad, they didn't want the railing to go right up to the roof. They only wanted it up to a certain height, and which worked for us. And so this was the result. Next. So you see here the whole idea of a pavilion actually, and being given different kinds of enclosures, different edges in order to interact with the transit. Next. Along with the bus stations, what is also required for the bus transit is the interchange stations, where people move from the BRTS to maybe a railway station, or maybe the state transport, or maybe the city bus. And what is also required is workshops and depots for the buses to be maintained every day. So on a daily basis, these buses go to these depots, they go to the workshops, they are maintained, and they park at night, and then they move out in the mornings. So what we have are a series of workshops and depots which were built as part of the system. Next. These are the ones at Ahmedabad. One of the things when we did our research and we moved across many of the bus workshops across the country, including the private ones at Tata and all of those, we found that they were large spans, but they had columns. And every column was damaged, and many of the buses got scratched. So here the client is not the people but the bus, and the bus has its own wayward movement sometimes, and it has to be kept away from the column. How does one do that? And that was what we wanted to work with, and eventually made this columnless space, which is a large cantilever. The buses come and park inside. Next. The other important thing that we saw when we looked at those workshops was that the drivers have to come in at very early on. They have to change into their uniforms. They have long shifts. They come tired in the afternoons. Many of them have to come later in the evening, have to stay on till late at night. And we encouraged drivers' facilities to be part of the program. And so what you see over here, this is an entire set of drivers' facilities that was created for the drivers at Ahmedabad. Next. This is the workshop at Surat, which follows a similar pattern. Next. Where you have these large columnless space for the buses. Next. And then the drivers' facilities. Lunch areas, changing facilities, an area to lie down, all of those kind of spaces, some semi-open, some covered as required. Next. So in Surat, in order to get that, while in Ahmedabad it was a cantilever, in Surat we created this large single span truss, and all the administrative services of the workshop was fit within the truss. Next. 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 This is the workshop and depot at Naya Raipur. And this was, so this is a, what happens here is that the bus system is actually a service that runs between the two cities, which is Raipur, which is the old capital, and Naya Raipur, which is the new capital, and it runs between this large open space which has nothing on it right now. And in the middle of that is, it's in a way a greenfield site where you have to locate these this workshop and depot. And you know, in some ways we started looking at the land, and the minute undulations is what gave us this very low building with undulations in the roof. We were also at all moments looking at various ways in which we would understand technology as contributing to the system, and therefore then how does our own understanding of technology and our own relationship with technology come into being. And we were looking at the whole idea of algorithms in order to design these trusses. Next. So we had, we tried to do, so each of these trusses are different. Each of them have some differences, and they all to eventually have to contribute to the idea of bringing light into the workshop, because otherwise those spaces become very dark. Next. So this is the kind of space you get within, where you have enough natural light, lot of free flowing air and space, so that the workshop is not a dull and dingy place for the people to work in. This is the control center, because these are all now managed and controlled by a control station, so that if a bus breaks down, then the message goes to the control room and another is sent, and all of those systems are now operational in these systems. And this is the control station for the Naya Raipur bus system. Next. This is the one in Surat, but this was not built, where we had lifted the entire control center from the ground, and the whole ground was created as a public space. Next. This is an interchange at Hubli Dharwad, and we are looking again at columnless spaces, large spaces which allow. The most important thing in this bus transit is the ability to allow people to move seamlessly without conflicting with motorized transport. And a lot of these efforts of the manner in which the sites are organized and the functions on the site are organized are done with keeping in mind the minimizing of conflict between different ways of moving. Next. So these are the arms of from the main station which come out onto for the parking of the state transport buses. Next. And this is the bridge which takes you to those spaces from the BRTS. Next. Am I overshooting the time too much? I will just run through this last one or two projects.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. So this is the Veer Savarkar Sports Facility. The reason why I put this under the advocacy is that in the minds of the Ahmedabad Corporation, who are the clients, this was a very simple, small project, not small so much, but simple project of providing sports facilities in the eastern part of the city. And what you see all around the sports facility are old industrial lands, and most of it is the housing for the workers who were eventually laid off because many of these mills have become defunct. A lot of, I think Mumbai has seen these kind of things. Now, what the clients had done was that this was not actually used, and it had 2 or 3 old buildings lying on it, but they were not going to be reused in any way, so they were going to pull it down. Also, it was a very odd shaped site, and the clients wanted to design a simple stadium over here. What we did was to work with the program. Next. And to try and find a way to encourage this to become a public space, but with two different aspects of the idea of publicness. On the one hand is a public space which is beyond a certain limit, which would be ticketed, and so the sports facilities areas are all ticketed, but the front part we convinced them to make it into a public garden where people can come and walk at all times. So this kind of encouraged the corporation to look at this not as something which was their territory and in a way enclosed, but to open it up. And what it did was actually create lot more interest in the people and lot more usage of the space. Next. This was done in the just in around 2002-2003, and at that time personal Wi-Fi and personal devices for the internet and all that was not such a big thing. So we actually worked with them and advocated the idea of spaces with Wi-Fi accessibility, spaces for reading for the children in the neighborhood, a creche, all of those kind of activities which were not directly related to the idea of sports to be included within this. And what it did was that, generally sports in these areas was seen as something which belonged to the younger men, and therefore this whole space would very quickly become the domain of the younger men of the neighborhood. But by bringing all these things within the program of this sports complex, we saw a lot of housewives starting to come with their children and use the gym and the sports facilities. We also saw a lot of elderly coming in to use the garden. So we actually, through the shifting of the program, were able to create a space with a much wider demography than was earlier anticipated. Next. The other important focus was to be able to create these open spaces like I showed you earlier in DAY also. So because public spaces, you never know how many people will actually congregate here at any moment. And we have to make space and allow for large congregations to occur. And so this large, big foyer kind of space was given, which led on to the actual sports ground at the back. Next. With all these large, so there's a certain scale to this whole project, but when it gets filled up with people, architecture starts receding, as we saw in the bus stations also. Next. It was a very long, so the siting of the building was also very particular because there were overhead high tension wires under which we could not construct. We needed this large open space for the field and track and field and football and all that. So we had to actually create the building in a very long and narrow space, and then to articulate the diversity of functions without breaking it up too much. So there's an architectural challenge along with all the other aspects of the site and the advocacy for a certain high quality benchmarking of public spaces. To the extent that this space now is actually quite coveted for political rallies. A lot of the councillors and the local corporators and all want to use this and promote this as their contribution to the neighborhood. Next. Next. This is the crash area that we created just abutting the swimming pool. Next. It also allowed us to incorporate the existing trees within the program. Otherwise, we would have to raise them to allow for the large sports facilities. Next. And you can see the germination of some of these ideas, which in the next project you will see becomes the major basis for the project. Next, just run through some of these slides, which are the photographs of the project. Some of these kind of spaces which allow people to gather. This is the gym overlooking the sports, and this was one of the first covered swimming pools in the city. And this kind of a pattern is now followed in many of the other swimming pools that they are covering. And now I come to the last project of my presentation, which is the Ahmedabad Zoo project. So we did this project in two parts. One is the master planning of which is seen on one side, how to designate a 10-year and a 20-year phased plan of development, primarily to decongest the existing facility. So the zoo had kept on adding to its kind of inventory because of various reasons, including conservation, including rehabilitation of the animals. But the actual area did not increase, and so there was a lot of congestion that was occurring within the existing zoo. And so the whole idea is not to increase the inventory, but to give more space. And the first one that we picked up to detail was the nocturnal house. Now, the nocturnal house started with the idea of creating a night safari, but the Indian zoo authority does not allow these spaces to be open after 6. In fact, the Indian zoo authority has some of the strictest policies with respect to how the animals in the zoo have to be treated. So we said, okay, then this becomes a nocturnal house, because we started moving. The master plan actually looked at restructuring the way the animals were living based on their habitats and their behavior within their habitats, rather than just clustering them all together. So this whole part were animals that were nocturnal animals. Now, how do we show the behavior of nocturnal animals during the daytime? And what we decided was to create a space that would feel like nighttime during the day. And I'll show you how it was done. Next. The first thing we found was that there were about 100 odd trees on this site. So all those little circles that you see are all the trees, and we managed to save 97 of them. So what we did was to create these little cave-like spaces between the trees. And that is how this whole plan emerged, where there are these little cave-like spaces between the trees. Then there was the other thing that we divided the nocturnal animals into 3 parts, the ones which are subterranean, the ones which are terrestrial, then the third which were the birds. Now in these 3 types, the first ones which you see as this kind of a tunnel kind of space in the beginning, so which you enter from this kind of egg-like space, you see the bottom corner. From there you move in, and that's the tunnel which takes you to through these spaces which are created for the subterranean animals. What also helped was that at this point the site had a level difference of almost 6 meters. So we actually dug out this tunnel, and then we used and stacked all the earth to be used, and the entire tunnel was created out of rammed earth. So we were looking at all of the idea of the entire ecosystem of the site as part of the project. Next. we've also used, so here you can see how the higher levels were dealt with, and then you have the lower levels. And the front part, which was the entrance with these curved walls, which brought people into the space from the lake and brought them into a tunnel kind of space. Next. So this is the construction going on of the rammed earth, and that you see the black is where the entrance to the cave-like space. The first space you entered was an interpretation center, and then you moved through the different enclosures. And each animal in this particular, in the way we designed, each animal had 3 different kind of spaces to inhabit. One was the enclosure which the people viewed, but much larger spaces behind that enclosure were provided for the animals to move about. So actually only what you see in from the public spaces is only about 20%, and the rest of it is used for the animals to move about behind the enclosures which we view, and a much smaller space for them to retire at night. So this also diversity also reduces the boredom that has been found among many of the zoo animals. What we also did was give more than 2 enclosures per animal, so you could rotate them within the enclosures again to be able to create diversity in their lives. A lot of this is done through a lot of intense and conversations with zoologists, with the director of the zoo, with the zoo authority, in order to be able to get as much knowledge as we can, and to create an environment which is therefore responding and creating a sense of education for the people rather than a viewership. Next. So this is the entrance. These are the ticket windows. All this earth was from the site, and then the rest of it, we couldn't use earth throughout the site because many of these nocturnal animals like porcupines have very sharp teeth, and they will actually dig through the walls. So we had to use stone. So we created caves through the use of stone. What we've done is in this
Meghal,
space.
could you just move a little faster, because I think
Yeah.
we have the next workshop in 2 minutes actually, so we'll have no time for Q&A otherwise.
Okay, yeah. So just run through the last few pictures, no? So this is the internal space which was created to give the sense of night time, and all the caves are light controlled so that they are day at night and night at day. Next. Yeah. So these are the kind of awards that the officers won over a period of time. That's the kind of space. Next. We don't have many private residences or interiors to show, but this is our own space that we've created, which is a small apartment, very regular apartment in the middle of the city. And this whole idea of the inside-outside relationship is very important to us, and this can be seen in the space that we inhabit ourselves. Yeah, I think that should be it. Thank you.
Thank you, Meghal.
Thank you, Ms. Yeah.
Thank you. So how do you want to do this? Because I think the students have another workshop, I believe, at 3:30, which is a minute away almost.
Yeah, that's all right. We can do slightly overlap maybe, but we can still do a moderated session. And before I give it up to you, can I just briefly introduce you?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you. The moderator for today, Mr. Rohan Shivakumar, is an architect, urban designer, and filmmaker practicing in Mumbai. He is the Dean of Research and Academic Development at Kamala Raheja Vidyanidhi Institute of Architecture and Environmental Studies. His work ranges from architecture, urban research, and consultancy projects to works in film and visual art. He is interested in issues concerning housing, public space, and in exploring the many ways of reading and representing the city. Rohan is a co-editor of the publication on an interdisciplinary research and art collaboration, Project Cinema City. He also curates film programs and writes on cinema, architecture, and urban issues. He has also made films on art, architecture, and urbanism, including Nostalgia for the Future, Lovely Villa, and Squeeze Lime in Your Eye. Yeah, with this, over to you, Mr. Rohan, and yeah, you can start.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Meghal. Thank you, everyone who for organizing this. And Meghal and Pinkish was very exciting and interesting presentations that really showed many different kinds of projects that you guys have been involved in, and that seem to be kind of also happening in this particular time that we occupy in India. Projects that range from private commissions to commissions that are being done by the state. To commissions that are being done by corporates. And I think it's an interesting thing to think about the way that the way that in some senses a portrait of patronage is also is also presented when we look at both your kind of bodies of work together. But before, and I think what I'll do is I'll just cut. I mean, I have a bunch of questions, but what I'll do is I think I'll stick to three primary sorts of questions. Maybe one which both of you can respond to, one specifically for Meghal and one specifically for Pinkish, and then we can open it out maybe to the audience and see whether there would be some questions there if we have the time to take them. And Maithili can tell us no, and we shall follow her orders. So the first question I'd like to ask both of you is, both of you are really deeply involved with the academic as much as you have your own practices, right? And I find that to be a very important sorts of aspect that connects the two of you all as practitioners. Uh, I mean, Meghal, you're deeply involved with this with SEPT Ahmedabad, and Pinkish, of course, with KRVIA, where I also teach. I'd just like to kind of ask both of you to briefly respond to how do you think your practice benefits from your association with the academic, and vice versa. How does the academic, in senses, what do you do as academics, and how do you think your kind of and what is the relationship from practice that you're bringing to the academic, and what advantages and sometimes disadvantages that lie in that kind of relationship? Pinkish, you want to start first, and maybe then I'll go to Meghal.
Okay. Uh, yeah, I mean, I think my involvement is in academics, maybe not as deep as yours is. I mean, I still kind of, have been a visiting faculty for the large amount of time that I have taught, which is now, I think, about 17, 18 years now. But yeah, and it's only in the last kind of 4 years that it has kind of deepened slightly more. So I think, when we started, I think about 17, 18 years back, we really felt a kind of a lack or like a vacuum in the practice about having stopped growing in some sense. Okay. And I think that a lot of questions that were kind of coming to our minds, I mean, contemporary kind of issues, we didn't kind of really have a platform to honestly discuss at a kind of very pragmatic level. I think the profession, unfortunately, at that time had also kind of, especially in the Mumbai context, degenerated to kind of be talking only about FSI and, getting stuff executed. I mean, what kind of Bombay is like in that sense. So I think there really was no space for discussion about kind of, larger things. And I think one of the primary kind of impulses to join, at least for me, was to kind of get away from all of that, to find a kind of a sane space to kind of think hopefully about things that are deeper, and kind of more meaningful in that sense. I would think primarily it kind of started with being an escape in some sense from the profession, to kind of give me kind of another foothold to kind of remain sane in the city. But I think what has been tremendous, at least out of personal experience, that it has allowed me to, I think, unlearn a lot. I mean, or de-learn, whatever is the right word, but to actually question deeply a lot of things that we've taken for granted, especially considering kind of our education has been in the kind of traditional Bohosian / kind of modernist thing coming from JJ in that sense. So I think the most important has been the unlearning, honestly, and I think that has uh, largely kind of manifested in the kind of way we kind of are looking at our projects, especially kind of some of the later ones. And I think you will see, a lot of what is spoken about in the school actually kind of hopefully demonstrated in practice here as well. I mean, so I think it kind of allows us to bridge those things. I mean, we've never seen it as two separate spaces. I mean, unfortunately, people have kind of really bifurcated these into two separate kind of environments, which they really don't need to be. I mean, so yeah, maybe Meghal can take that on for the.
Thanks. Yeah, so for me, these two happened parallelly. In fact, so I was a bit of a practitioner and a bit of an academic almost from day one. I always had a greater interest in the idea of academics. And more than, in fact, I don't even use the word academics. I see more of myself as a teacher than an academic, because academics has a much larger, is a much larger thing. And I think I'm a little smaller than that idea of academic. And to being a teacher, one of the most important things that one had to be is to be open to ideas. One always has to have a very open mind and accept many things. All 40 students are going to come with 40 different ideas, and how do you can't impose yourself on them. And to me, that sense of not imposing oneself onto a project, and that's something also that comes because Vijay also taught for early 10 years of his life. It was only after the practice was moving in a certain direction we realized that someone will have to hold that horse a little more strongly. And the idea of accepting diversities, the multiplicities that are going on across the world, and to make an impact. You see, when you talk to 40 students, you're making an impact. Or right now we're talking to 144 students, you're making an impact to the way they will see architecture. Whereas if I'm building a house, I will make an impact on a life of 4 or 5 people. And I think that idea of making an impact, it's a bit, maybe a bit arrogant, I don't know. But the idea of being able to make an impact on a much larger, that's why we also, I think, gradually moved into the idea of public architecture. Because there we were able to contribute to the lives of a very different and diverse set of people, much larger set of people. So, to be very open to ideas and, really just be a recipient of ideas than really a disperser of ideas. So that was one very important thing. 2, the idea of being able to make a larger impact. 3, the deep sense of research that academics brings. Now this is the other way around. So the deep sense of research that academics or the idea of teaching brings, because if you are a teacher trying to teach, always, the age group you're teaching is always going to be out there looking at things, and they're going to be much sharper and faster than you are. So it keeps you agile. And that agility is very useful in practice. So it doesn't allow you to be in a rut. It doesn't allow you to kind of be complacent. So it kills complacency from a practice. So that is where the reverse happens actually. And finally, in terms of teaching, because I practice, there is a certain groundedness in what I'm doing. So while I'm allowing those students their 40 different ideas, I'm also at the back of my mind having it in me to say that, okay, somewhere along the line, your structure is not, finally architects have to answer to gravity, if nothing else. So that kind of back and forth continues. And that is what keeps you, on your edge all the time. I don't know if that's a good state to be in, but nonetheless it does.
No, that's an interesting kind of way of talking about it, I think, because another thing that struck me about your presentation in particular was its kind of very clear focus on the idea of the public, and I was really I was placing the work that you're doing in the history of, let's say, modern architecture across since the 1940s, and thinking about the role that our entire kind of idea of India emerges, especially within architectural terms, in Ahmedabad at a certain time, with a particular kind of imagination of Indianness that comes up. But that is of course very closely related with the ideological position of the government or the state at that time, right? Now, given the vicissitudes of political ideologies that we are currently living through, okay, I really wanted to ask you as to how do you kind of negotiate that relationship between the vicissitudes of political ideology and your belief systems as far as architects are concerned. And I'm sure that's not necessarily always very compatible. So how does one manage that relationship?
It's a question that we answer on an everyday basis, Rohan. Actually, you have to work this out almost on a daily basis. So there are many things that support and help us through that journey. It's a difficult journey. That's why, that State of Architecture exhibition told us that only 3% of Indian architects actually find a space in the government as a practitioner. The political ideologies in our 20 years of practice have shifted tremendously. Okay, they've changed. Our country's leanings have changed over a period of time, in this very short time, actually. What does not change eventually, while personal political ideologies may change, what does not change is that the idea that at least till now, the government has to contribute to the public. Okay, that fundamental, is still essentially embedded within all our policies and all our SOPs. That the government has to, and our social and public institutions are still fairly resilient to the variations that they have to deal with. And so our forefathers did a good job, I think, in writing down some of those things. And if we keep that as the base, that our projects have to support that idea that they are for the public good, then what varies are the processes that individuals who are your client, they're actually not your clients, they are really the sponsors. And that is where always we have a variation. Our clients are the people, if you consider people who inhabit, our clients are different from the people who pay for it. So we have sponsors and clients. And even if those individuals change, even if their personal ideologies differ, and maybe therefore the kind of projects they want to do may change. So somebody may want to do, for a longest time, people wanted to do the public transit, and the whole country seems to want to do this modal shift. Then maybe somebody wants to do education, somebody else wants to do exhibitions and museums. Things of that nature and the programs which support the ideologies may change, but the larger public good as the underlying factor for all these projects remains constant. And if we latch on to that, then we deal with the processes as and how they come. But at the end of every day, we have to still remind ourselves that it is for the larger good. And that is what helps anchor us to these kind of shifts, and many times anchor us in a way where our own personal beliefs are very different and often conflict from the beliefs of the sponsor. But we have to accept the fact, in fact, it teaches us to accept the fact that we live in a country where diversity is celebrated, no? So they have the right to their ideologies and they have a right to their belief system, whatever is that background. But if the common ground is public good, then we take off from that.
Yeah, that's actually the big kind of question, of course, that the country is going through. That is, what is the public and what is the good of the public? And you see that every day in the newspapers and across your WhatsApp feeds or whatever, because there's always a big tumult, especially now, concerning what we call the public good.
But in that sense, we are conservative in our understanding of public good.
Yeah, so that's the interesting thing about it. I like, I'm just trying to draw a connection also to the fact that Pinkish shared the preamble of the Constitution as one of the kinds of things that he felt was an important kind of value system we need to reach back into to be able to really find what we call public and what we call good. And I think that's a good sort of incredible sort of document itself that really sets out how we can calibrate value very often about what architecture can do. And what we call good architecture, and I would really like to kind of bring the idea of making and crafting back into the kind of question as far as this is concerned, because in some sense I'm using Pinkish's title, Building Ideas, to really kind of look at trying to draw these two together. And I was looking for the ideas, I was thinking about kind of ideology, and this is why the question happened to you. But I would really like to talk about building now a little bit, just to kind of move that out. And I was curious about Pinkish's sort of interesting kind of collision between craft and I guess digital kinds of techniques, and we see that as and very often when we are looking at ideas of the future that are being seen on our screens, computer screens, there is this entire idea of the parametric that seems to be very much in the air. And somehow the parametric is always imagined as something that happens in some sort of random digital universe, which is abstracted to the point where it only exists within some abstract plane. But when I think about the idea of crafting and using both the idea of the Indian craftsman as well as what Pinkish was really talking about, which is looking at the idea of the vernaculars, which are not only rural but also urban vernaculars as ways in which one can create kinds of architectures. I was actually wondering whether that is really a sort of maybe it's a signboard for us to really rethink entirely ideas of what is called beauty, or what is called the design, or what is called the form. And I think Pinkish, you may want to elaborate your entire kind of struggle with both in the collage house as well as the housing project, with the idea of how much does one design and how much does one leave.
Yeah, I mean, very kind of interesting and pertinent kind of question. I'm not sure I'm the kind of right person to talk about the kind of digital in some sense, because we honestly haven't really dabbled in it. I mean, either the parametric kind of space is really not, I mean, our space in some sense. But I think the idea of the kind of the man and the machine kind of conflict, which is in some sense been eternal, I mean, across kind of the history of architecture also and society in some sense. But for us, at some point, we really kind of, began to question, Rohan, that today in India, we are still able to kind of get, people to do things that the machine can, and the machine will do it in 2 minutes and the human will take 2 days. And what is it that one values, eventually? I mean, and especially kind of, I think, working in some of the projects where craft has really kind of been, extended. It's also for us working at a level at like, how can you take this resource which a client or a patron is actually putting into a project, and actually kind of distribute it in some sense to as many kind of people as possible. I mean, you can give it to one person who owns that machine, or you can distribute it to like 10 craftsmen who would kind of then take longer to do it. I mean, so I mean, there is a kind of question of equity kind of built into this whole thing. Now, it's also a double-edged sword, in the sense that one is beginning to see, as I mentioned, labor and kind of the quality kind of craftsmanship actually kind of recede over a period of time, as against say when I kind of started out in practice. But it's also that we don't always entirely have fair kind of systems of enabling these craft or artisanal practices. I mean, right from say the wage that they earn to kind of the kind of environment in which they practice. So I mean, it's problematic at some levels. I mean, and it is increasingly getting more and more difficult, expensive, in every which way. I mean, so yeah, so as far as we are concerned, that's kind of the space we are. I'm not sure I can comment too much on the digital, like I mentioned, but I think we need to move now from the parametric to actually more like AI, or like, because I think that's really where we are going to see kind of, processes beginning to change a lot, I mean, and I again don't think, Rohan, we need to see these as binaries or being in opposition, that one can actually start looking at these working simultaneously. I mean, honestly, we haven't done anything like that, but I know that
I'm actually thinking about that as a possibility, to start
absolutely,
imagining
absolutely.
whether one can imagine digital tools that right now are so easily available to almost anybody with a phone.
Right.
Whether those can really enable a new vernaculars of craft that can also happen, rather than us thinking about it
Absolutely,
purely
yeah.
as something that is kind of like parametric digital stuff. But I
Right,
mean, just to kind of invert the question now, I mean, I'm going to kind of try and do this once, because I was thinking about you were talking about is time, as an important factor in the way that in the way that kind of things are judged often, whether quick or fast, and that is especially so in government contracts, which require a certain kind of production, right? And of course a certain kind of cost, right? So I was thinking about that, Meghal, because especially in that first project that you showed, you're so interested in the making and those crafts. Do you find it easy or difficult to kind of negotiate that, like, the idea that you want to work with local crafts, but also at the same time you're working with the government agencies that have a completely different set of value systems?
So both, we had two projects. In fact, most of our projects have to deal with this situation because I think architecture school teaches you to kind of find loopholes more than work the straight path, fundamental education is to try to find how to work around the SORs and how to work within them in a different way. Because eventually, for the government officers, the SOR is the Bible. And early on, we learned to accept it, that this is what it was. At the same time, we started looking at ways in which we could push those boundaries. So, for example, for the Mewar complex project, for that kind of workmanship, which you would not, or for that kind of making, you would not find it in a regular SOR. So we took a regular SOR and we took a regular item in a regular SOR and then added on to it. So there are existing systems, and if you learn enough of them, you can find a way to deal with them. Now, one part is to the SOR and all that becomes important because the officers have to be convinced that it can be done. Then comes the craftsmen, so the contractors. Now, that is where we found that like the more difficult, the Mewar complex was actually not as difficult because the contractors were all local, right? So they are from Rajasthan. So that inherent skill and the craftsmen with their inherent skills, and for them to procure the craftsmen is not a difficult task at all. So they were not such a big challenge. The bigger challenge was the work to be done for the nocturnal house in Ahmedabad, which was the stone craftsmen in Ahmedabad in the city is not possible, and rammed earth as an idea in the. But it is very interesting to know that our SORs are actually fairly extensive, so they do actually have these items. So we can, if we dig deep enough and we do our research, we will find ways in being able to do this. So the systems, like I said, are there. We have to be able to work with them. Convincing the contractors in this case was a much bigger challenge, and so the project, which would have been done in 2 years, took almost 4 to 5 years, and was a very slow process simply because of that resistance. But and that's I don't think that a government project is any particularly different in terms of resistance as a regular project in a project in a private domain can also run into resistances of all kinds.
That's also true. I think what I'll do is maybe I kind of just stop here because I think we've gone almost half an hour into the discussion, and the students are probably have other places to go. Maithili, do you think there's some questions that the students want to ask?
Yeah, maybe most of them I think were answered in the course of discussions, but then maybe I would just like to pick two of them, one for each of the speakers, and then we can conclude. Yeah. So one is by Deepta Madan Gopal, one of our students. So she has a question to architect Pinkish. Since modular houses have not picked up as fast in India as in the West, what are some of the challenges you think you would face in modular structures in specific modular housing communities? That's a question directed to you.
Okay. I think modular construction, prefab construction is essentially a game of scale actually, and the larger the numbers that you have, the more kind of feasible it does become. So I think as we are seeing housing projects scale up across the country, especially from a push from the kind of government side, and you have the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana. I think one is beginning to kind of see a greater kind of shift, and see more and more of these actually see the light of day far more, because there seems to be kind of an acceptance that the problem is immense, the time is running out, and we need to kind of do this rapidly. I mean that the question of speed seems to have become key, especially from the state side. So I think that going into the future, one will see more and more of this actually play out as the scale of the projects consolidate, and we see larger projects, say 500,000 kind of 2,000 units actually happening on singular sites, or where technologies are able to be kind of also used on multiple sites, with the same system, so I think the future is going to show a lot of these it's honestly already happening. A lot of developers have kind of started the use of this, and it almost kind of becomes like a test bed before it becomes kind of mainstream, and kind of the state then sees it as being acceptable and kind of takes it ahead as the normal in some sense. So we will see a lot of this going into the future.
Yeah, thank you, sir. And question from a student, Harish Karthik, for Ms. Arya. From the projects that were shown, we could notice in many of them a very similar design language, or solid concrete forms left exposed, put together with steel members and sheeting. Is there a specific reason behind this design language that is very expressive and strong?
So, yes, you would notice them particularly in the larger scale institutional projects. One of the reasons why we use that very often is that these are buildings which are public buildings, which are going to undergo a lot of wear and tear. And these are sturdy materials which will withhold through time. So that is one important factor. Two, that concrete is almost our vernacular now, and most of the contracting agencies that we get now are fairly conversant with dealing with concrete. Like what Rohan asked earlier, to get them to do things other than concrete is a task. So keeping the wear and tear and the idea, also both of those projects required large spans. So the question of steel comes in. So these are all not necessarily that they are coming from a personal view of doing concrete and steel, but really emerging out of what is required by the projects. And they happen to be projects which have similar conditions in terms of their usage, sometimes in terms of their program requirements, in terms of their spatial requirements, and hence the language. And then the language eventually comes out of one person or two people working on it, and therefore the similarities.
So just to kind of extend that question, if I'm allowed, Maithili, I mean, if you move away from the material thing, Meghal, I mean, there seems to be a definite fascination for the kind of diagonal, I mean, in some sense, across projects. I mean, where is that come from, or is there something you would want to kind of share with us?
I think that there are two projects, which is the education hub, the central space, and the sports facility, the central college. Both of them are almost similar kind of situations.
Actually, I see it across all the projects. I don't think it's only those, but maybe the students also kind of caught on to that. But and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it's
not
just
a bad thing,
an
but
observation.
Nice to know that there's something which we can, sometimes we do things that we don't ourselves observe. It's only when somebody else looks at, and which is why some of these presentations are actually quite good, because somebody else observes things that we don't see ourselves. But for these two that particular kind of column came out of this need to have as many less columns and as large a span. So when you give it a less bottom and then open it up, it comes from the mushroom column idea. And it allows us a much larger span with lesser number of columns on the floor.
I mean, what I find interesting is that even in that complete streets competition, even the smallest kind of stool or the planter is also tilted. I mean that it doesn't kind of find. So it's actually across scales and across materials and across projects. I mean, so it transcends scale in some sense. So
I think it probably just trying to do something which in a way tries to bring out certain contrasts from the existing norms, and to place certain things which are to be differentiated particularly. It is just a move that uses the need to differentiate particular spaces, particular expressions, and to be able to, in a way, direct people towards a certain space, towards a certain kind of observation. So I think that is where it's coming from. But I think the library doesn't have it.
No, the library does. But we didn't see it in more detail. Once we see it kind of being built, we'll know, you know.
We'll find some maybe.
Yeah.
But
Or we'll
no,
stand
just
back.
Yeah.
Okay, so on that note, though this discussion would have definitely carried on for some more time, but due to time limit, we will have to cut it short here now. And with this, we have come to the end of the session, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank our wonderful speakers, Mr. Pinkish Shah and Ms. Meghal Arya, for sharing their thoughts and experiences and their valuable time. I also would like to thank Mr. Rohan Shivakumar for moderating the session and adding value to the discussion with his interpretations. We would like to thank our sponsors for the event, Page 3 Bookshop under Gold category. Under the Silver category, we have Metro Books, Kit Ply, Mehta Book Sales, Bookspace and LIC India. Very big thank you to the audience for such wonderful participation. And I would like to ask Dr. Mamta Piraj if you want to kind of do a concluding note. Ma'am, you're on mute, I think. No, it's not audible. Okay, I think she's not able to unmute for some reason. Okay, I would like I would like to inform the participants registered under various workshops to head towards the um, events that are scheduled, and we also have a cultural event starting at 6:30 followed by valedictory function which will be streamed live on a YouTube channel. Please do join us for that, and thank you everyone for joining us today, and yeah, have a good day. Thank you.
Bye bye.
Thank you
thank
for
you,
inviting
thank you
us.
Bye.
everybody.
Thank
Thanks for
you.
your
Bye.
patience. Bye.
Bye.